Illyra's hands froze over the bowl of crushed herbs when she heard the horn sound from the eastern gate. 3 long blows. That was the signal for a royal arrival, and only one man in the world made her heart drop the moment she heard it. She told herself it was nothing. Horns sounded all the time. Messengers came and went, but something in her chest already knew the truth before her mind caught up, and she hated how her body still remembered him after 6 years of silence. Outside her small healing hut, the border village of Thornfield buzzed with sudden movement. Children ran toward the gate to see what the noise meant. Old women pulled their shawls tighter and whispered to each other. Illyra wiped her hands on her apron and stepped to the doorway, telling herself she would only look, nothing more. That was when she saw him. Chaol, the Alpha King, riding at the front of a small procession, wearing a dark cloak that could not hide the crown resting on his head. He looked older than she remembered, his jaw sharper, his shoulders broader, but his eyes were the same. And those eyes found her instantly, as if 6 years apart had not dulled his memory of exactly where to look. Illyra stepped back into the shadows of her hut before he could see her clearly. Her heart pounded so hard she pressed a hand against her chest, willing it to slow down. This could not be happening. He was married. She had heard it from 3 different traders, each one repeating the same story with the same certainty. Chaol, heir of the Alpha throne, had wed a noblewoman named Seraphine from the Crimson Pack 2 years ago. The whole territory had celebrated for a week. So why was he here, at her door, in a village that held nothing of value to a king? She busied herself with her herbs again, grinding roots that did not need grinding, refusing to look up when she heard boots stop just outside her hut. A shadow fell across the threshold. Illyra. His voice had not changed, deep, steady, the same voice that once whispered promises to her under a summer sky 6 years ago. She kept her eyes on the bowl in front of her. "My king," she said, her voice flat and careful. "This hut serves the sick and the injured. I don't believe you fall under either description." "You'd be surprised," Chaol said, stepping inside without invitation. He lifted his right arm slightly, and she noticed for the first time the makeshift bandage wrapped around his forearm, dark with what looked like dried blood. "A training accident. My guard insisted I see a healer before we continued our journey." Illyra finally looked up at him, and the sight of his face this close nearly broke the wall she had spent 6 years building. She forced herself to focus on the wound instead of the man. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the wooden stool beside her work table. "Let me see it." He obeyed, and for a moment, neither of them spoke as she unwrapped the bandage with careful fingers. The cut beneath was shallow, cleaner than any wound she had ever treated. Too clean, too straight. Real training accidents did not leave marks like this. She said nothing about her suspicion. Instead, she reached for a jar of healing salve and began applying it in silence, refusing to let her hands shake, even though every part of her wanted to run. "You look well," Chaol said quietly. "I look tired," Illyra corrected. "It's harvest season. Half the village has cuts and burns from the fields. I heard you became the village healer. Old Bram speaks highly of you." Illyra paused, her fingers still against his skin. "You've been asking about me." It was not a question, and Chaol did not pretend otherwise. "I have never stopped asking about you, Illyra." The words hung in the small space between them, heavy and dangerous. Illyra pulled her hands back and reached for a strip of clean cloth instead, needing distance, needing something to do with her fingers besides trembling. "You have a wife," she said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. "A queen. I heard the celebrations lasted a week. The whole territory spoke of nothing else for a month afterward." Something flickered across Chaol's face, there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. "The marriage was arranged by my father before he passed. A political alliance between our packs and the Crimson Pack. It had nothing to do with love." "That doesn't matter," Illyra said, wrapping the bandage tighter than necessary around his arm. "A vow is a vow, whether it comes from love or duty. You made one to her. You made one to me too, once, and you broke it." The accusation slipped out before she could stop it, 6 years of buried hurt rising to the surface in an instant. Chaol's jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he might argue. Instead, he simply nodded, accepting the blow. "I know," he said. "I have thought of little else since the day I left you at that river crossing. I told you I would return within a season. Instead, my father fell ill. The packs turned against each other, and by the time I could breathe again, 3 years had passed. Then came the marriage arrangement, forced upon me, before I even understood what was happening. I was not free to come back to you, Elira, not the way I wanted to. You could have sent word, Elira said. Her voice cracked slightly, the first sign of the wall crumbling, and she hated herself for it. 1 letter. 1 messenger. Anything to tell me you were still alive, that you had not simply forgotten the promise you made me under that tree. I sent 3 letters, Cale said quietly. None of them reached you. My father's council intercepted every message meant for anyone outside our territory during the war years. I did not learn this until much later, when I finally had enough power to demand answers. Elira stared at him, unsure whether to believe the excuse or dismiss it as convenient timing. 6 years of pain did not vanish because of one explanation, however sincere it sounded. It doesn't change anything, she finally said, stepping back and busying herself with putting away her supplies. You are married. I am a village healer. Whatever we were to each other belongs to the past, and it should stay there. Cale stood slowly, testing the bandage on his arm with a small flex of his fingers. I did not come here to disturb your peace, Elira. I came because Thornfield sits along the border route, and my journey required passing through. The injury was simply an excuse to see you, if I am being honest. I wanted to know you were well. The confession stunned her into silence. She had suspected the wound was not what it seemed, but hearing him admit it so plainly still caught her off guard. That was reckless, she said finally, though her voice had softened despite her best efforts. A king does not need to injure himself to visit a healer's hut. You could have simply asked for me by name. Would you have agreed to see me, if I had asked plainly? Cale asked, a faint, knowing smile touching the corner of his mouth. Elira opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again, because she knew the honest answer was no. She would have refused, would have hidden herself away rather than face the man who broke her heart and then married someone else. The wound, whatever its true purpose, had been the only way past her defenses. You should go, she said instead, turning away to hide the conflict written plainly across her face. Your procession is waiting. A king cannot linger in a border village without questions being asked. Cale did not move toward the door immediately. Instead, he studied her for a long moment, as if trying to memorize every detail of her face before he had to leave again. Thank you for tending to my arm, he said finally, and for your honesty, even when it was not kind. I deserved every word of it. He turned and walked toward the doorway, pausing just before stepping outside. For what it's worth, Elira, I never stopped loving you. Marriage or not, crown or not, that has never changed. Then he was gone, his cloak disappearing into the crowd gathered outside her hut, leaving her standing alone amid the scent of crushed herbs and old wounds that refused to heal. Elira did not move for a long time after he left. She stared at the empty doorway, her mind replaying every word he had spoken, searching for lies and finding none. That frightened her more than anything else. If he had lied, she could have hated him cleanly, without complication. But the truth in his voice, the pain in his eyes when he spoke of the intercepted letters, the confession about the faked injury, all of it painted a picture far more complicated than the simple story she had told herself for 6 years. She had built her life around the idea that Cale had simply forgotten her, that his love had been shallow and easily replaced. It was easier to believe that than to imagine him fighting circumstances beyond his control, trapped by duty and politics while she waited alone, growing older with each passing season, refusing every suitor who came to her door, because her heart remained stubbornly loyal to a promise made under a summer sky. Outside, the village continued its normal rhythm, unaware of the storm that had just passed through one small healing hut. Children still played near the well. Farmers still carried baskets of grain toward the storehouse. Life continued exactly as it always had, indifferent to the fact that Elira's careful world had just been shaken to its foundation. She sat down heavily on the stool where Cale had been sitting moments before, staring at the bandage scraps still scattered across her work table. Her fingers trembled as she gathered them, and she realized with a sinking feeling that 6 years of careful healing, of convincing herself she had moved past him, had not healed anything at all. It had simply buried the wound deeper, waiting for the right moment to reopen. That night, Elira could not sleep. She lay awake in her small bed above the healing hut, staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling, replaying every second of Cale's visit. She thought of Seraphine, a woman she had never met but now could not stop imagining, wondering what she looked like, whether she was kind, whether she knew her husband had ridden to a border village and faked an injury just to see another woman. The thought made Alira feel sick with guilt, even though she had done nothing wrong. She had not sought Cale out. She had not encouraged his visit. And yet, some small, dangerous part of her heart had felt something rekindle the moment he stepped through her door, something she thought had died years ago. She rose before dawn, unable to bear the stillness of her bed any longer, and made her way down to the hut to prepare for the day's work. As she ground herbs and organized supplies, she made herself a quiet promise. Whatever Cale's true feelings, whatever complications existed in his marriage, she would not allow herself to become entangled in a situation that could only end in more heartbreak. She had survived 6 years without him. She could survive whatever came next, as long as she kept her guard raised and her heart protected. But even as she made the promise, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that some walls, once cracked, could never be fully rebuilt. And somewhere beyond the village, riding back toward his kingdom, with a bandage he did not truly need, Cale carried the same unsettled feeling, the same certainty that seeing Alira again had changed everything, whether either of them was ready for it or not. The border village of Thornfield returned to its quiet routines as the days passed, but Alira found herself listening for horns she told herself she did not want to hear, and watching the eastern road with eyes that betrayed the promise she had made to her own heart. By mid-morning, word of the king's visit had already spread through Thornfield like fire through dry grass. Alira's young apprentice, a bright girl named Ivy, burst through the door of the hut, with her eyes wide and her basket of gathered roots forgotten at her side. "Is it true?" Ivy asked breathlessly. "The whole market is saying the Alpha King himself came to see you, but they say he rode all this way just for a scratch on his arm." Alira kept her eyes on the mortar and pestle in front of her, grinding dried mint leaves with more force than the task required. He was passing through the border route. His guard insisted he see a healer, that is all it was. Ivy did not look convinced, but she was wise enough not to push further, at least not directly. Instead, she began sorting the roots she had gathered, glancing up every so often, as if hoping Alira might offer more details on her own. "Old Bram says the king used to come through Thornfield often, years ago, before he became king," Ivy said carefully. "He says there were stories about a healer's daughter who caught his eye." "Old Bram talks too much," Alira replied, though there was no real anger in her voice, only weariness. "Whatever stories he remembers belong to a different time. They have no bearing on today." Ivy seemed to sense the conversation had reached its limit, and returned to her sorting in comfortable silence, the kind that came from years of working alongside someone patient and kind. Alira was grateful for the girl's quiet company, even as her own mind continued to circle back to the eastern road and the man who had ridden away from it. Later that afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent toward the hills, an elderly woman named Rosalind arrived at the hut with a swollen ankle, twisted while carrying water from the well. Alira welcomed the distraction, focusing fully on the familiar rhythm of her work, wrapping the joint with practiced hands, while Rosalind chatted about village happenings. "They say the Queen did not travel with him," Rosalind mentioned casually, as if discussing the weather. "Strange, isn't it? A king traveling the border route without his wife at his side. Most royal couples like to be seen together, especially in troubled times like these." Alira's hands paused for the briefest moment before continuing their work. "Perhaps the Queen had other duties to attend to," she offered, keeping her tone light and uninterested, though the comment lodged itself firmly in her thoughts. "Perhaps," Rosalind agreed, though her knowing look suggested she believed there was more to the story than either of them was saying aloud. After Rosalind left, Alira closed the hut for the evening and walked to the edge of the village, where a small stream cut through the fields, before disappearing into the forest beyond. This had always been her place to think, ever since she was a child, learning healing craft from her mother. The water moved steadily, indifferent to the turmoil in her chest, and she found herself sitting on the familiar flat stone she had claimed as her own years ago. She thought of the tree by the river crossing, the one Cale had mentioned, where he had made his promise to her 6 years ago. She had not visited that spot since the day he left, unable to bear the memories it held. Now, after seeing him again, she wondered if the ache she felt was grief for what had been lost, or something more dangerous, a spark of hope she had believed long extinguished. As darkness settled over Thornfield, Elira made her way back to the hut, more unsettled than she had been in years. Whatever Cale's true intentions, whatever complications lay ahead, she understood one thing clearly. The quiet, careful life she had built for herself over the past 6 years had just been disturbed in a way that would not easily settle again. And somewhere beyond the hills, riding toward a castle that held a marriage without love, Cale carried the same restless certainty, already planning his next excuse to return to the border village and the woman he had never truly stopped loving. 3 weeks passed before Elira heard the eastern horn again, and this time her body reacted before her mind could stop it, her heart lurching with a mixture of dread and something she refused to name. She had spent those 3 weeks trying to forget the king's visit, throwing herself into her work with a fierce dedication that left her exhausted by nightfall. She treated broken bones, fevers, and burns from the harvest fires, filling every waking hour with tasks that left no room for thoughts of Cale or the promise he had spoken before leaving her hut. It had almost worked. Almost. Now, standing in her doorway and watching a familiar procession approach along the eastern road, she felt every carefully constructed defense crumble at once. This time, Cale did not come with a fake wound. He came openly, dismounting his horse just outside the village boundary and walking the rest of the way on foot, as if trying to seem less like a king and more like the man she once knew. Villagers stopped their tasks to watch him pass, whispering among themselves, though none dared approach too closely. Elira stepped back inside her hut, busying her hands with anything she could find, though her mind raced with questions. Why had he come again, so soon, without even the pretense of an injury this time? What could he possibly want from her that he had not already said during his last visit? The answer arrived moments later, when Cale appeared in her doorway, his expression more serious than she remembered from their previous meeting. "I need to speak with you," he said without preamble. "Not as a king, not with excuses, just as myself." Elira crossed her arms, guarding herself against the pull she felt whenever he was near. "You already said what you needed to say last time. I don't see what more there is to discuss." "There's a great deal more," Cale said, stepping further into the hut. "I owe you an explanation you deserve to hear in full, not the fragments I gave you before. Will you listen, or should I leave?" Something in his tone, steady but pleading, made Elira hesitate. Against her better judgment, she gestured to the stool near her work table, the same one he had sat on during his last visit. "Sit, I'll listen, but I make no promises about what happens after." Cale sat, folding his hands in his lap as he gathered his thoughts. Elira remained standing, needing the small physical distance to protect herself from whatever he was about to reveal. "When I left you 6 years ago, my father had already begun negotiations with the Crimson Pack," Cale began. "Territory disputes had turned violent along our shared border, and he believed a marriage alliance was the only way to prevent full war between our peoples. I did not know this at the time. I truly believed I would return to you within a season, as I promised. But you didn't return," Elira said quietly. "You stayed away for 3 years before I even heard rumors of a marriage." "My father fell ill shortly after I left you," Cale continued, his voice heavy with old grief. "The illness weakened him for nearly 2 years before it finally took his life. During that time, I was forced to take on more of his responsibilities, learning to lead a pack that was already fracturing under the weight of border conflicts. I had no time, no freedom, and as I told you before, my letters to you were intercepted by council members who believed any outside attachment would weaken my position as future alpha." Elira listened, her arms still crossed, though her posture had softened slightly as the story unfolded. "And the marriage? That came after my father's death," Cale said. "The Crimson Pack's leader, a man named Corwin, demanded the alliance be sealed through marriage before he would agree to end hostilities. My council insisted I had no choice. Refusing would have meant continued war, more deaths on both sides of the border. I agreed to the marriage because I saw no other path forward that would not cost innocent lives." "So you married a stranger to save your people," Elira said slowly, testing the weight of the explanation. "And you expect me to simply accept that, To forgive 6 years of silence and heartbreak because duty demanded it? I don't expect forgiveness, Cale said, meeting her eyes directly. I only wanted you to know the truth. What you believe after hearing it is entirely your choice. Illyra turned away, walking toward the small window that overlooked the village square, needing a moment to process everything he had shared. Outside, life continued its normal rhythm, unaware of the conversation unfolding within the healer's hut. Tell me about her, Illyra said finally, her back still turned. Your wife, Seraphine. Cale was quiet for a long moment before answering. She is intelligent, and she has been kind to me in her own way, given the circumstances neither of us chose. But there is no love between us, Illyra. There never has been. We share a title and a bedchamber that remains, by mutual agreement, entirely separate. Our marriage exists on paper and in ceremony alone. Illyra turned back to face him, studying his expression for any sign of deception and finding none. That sounds like a lonely existence for both of you. It is, Cale admitted. Seraphine once told me she agreed to the marriage only because her own heart belonged to someone she could never have, a warrior from her original pack who held a rank too low for her family to approve. We understood each other from the beginning. Neither of us pretended to love the other. Then why stay married at all, if there is no love and no true bond between you? Illyra asked, genuinely curious despite herself. Because breaking the alliance now would undo everything my father sacrificed to prevent war, Cale said. Corwin remains a proud and dangerous leader. An annulment without proper cause would be seen as an insult, potentially reigniting the very conflict this marriage was meant to end. I am trapped by the same duty that separated us 6 years ago, Illyra. That has not changed, even now that I finally understand the full truth. The honesty in his words struck Illyra harder than any excuse could have. He was not asking her to wait for him, not making promises he could not keep. He was simply telling her the truth of his situation, painful and complicated as it was. Then what do you want from me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why come here at all, if nothing can change between us? Cale rose from the stool and crossed the small space between them, stopping just close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, though he did not reach for her. I want your friendship, if nothing else can be offered. I want to know you are safe and well, to hear your voice, to see the healer you have become. I understand if you cannot forgive me, and I understand if you believe it is safer to send me away permanently. But I could not continue living so close to you, knowing the truth of what happened, without at least offering you honesty. Illyra felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely, unwilling to let him see how deeply his words had affected her. Friendship, she repeated slowly, testing the word. Is that truly all you're asking for? For now, Cale said honestly. I will not lie to you and pretend my feelings have changed, Illyra. They have not. But I respect whatever boundaries you set. If friendship is all you can offer, I will treasure it. If you ask me to leave and never return, I will honor that as well, though it will cost me more than you know. The vulnerability in his admission broke something loose in Illyra's chest. A wall she had spent 6 years reinforcing, now cracking under the weight of his honesty. She had expected excuses, empty promises, perhaps even manipulation, designed to win back her affection despite his marriage. Instead, she found only truth, however painful, offered without demand or expectation. I need time, she finally said. Time to think about what any of this means. Time to decide whether I can trust you again after everything that happened. Can you give me that, without pressure, without more visits until I am ready? Cale nodded, stepping back to give her the space she needed. Take whatever time you require. I will not return until you send word that you are ready, or until circumstances beyond my control demand another visit. He turned to leave, pausing once more at the doorway as he had during his last visit. Thank you for listening, Illyra. Whatever you decide, know that the truth I shared today was not meant to burden you further, only to free you from believing lies about a man who never stopped loving you, even when duty forced his hand against his own heart. After he left, Illyra sat alone in her hut for a long time, staring at the herbs and supplies surrounding her, without truly seeing any of them. The story he had shared painted a far more complicated picture than the simple betrayal she had believed for 6 years. A father's dying wish, a forced political marriage, intercepted letters meant to keep them apart. None of it erased the pain of the years she had spent waiting and grieving, but it changed the shape of her anger, softening the edges just enough to let something more complicated take root. That evening, as she prepared for bed, Illyra found herself standing before the small chest where she kept mementos from her youth, things she had not looked at in years. She lifted the lid slowly and found, buried beneath old letters from her mother and dried flowers pressed between pages of a worn book, a small carved wooden bird Cale had given her the day before he left, a symbol of the freedom he promised they would share once his duties allowed him to return. She held the small carving in her palm, running her thumb over the smooth wood, and allowed herself, for the first time in 6 years, to cry without restraint, for everything that had been lost, and everything that might still be possible. However complicated and uncertain the path ahead remained. The following morning, Ivy arrived early to help prepare the day's supplies and immediately noticed the change in her teacher's demeanor. Illyra moved slower than usual, her eyes distant, though she smiled whenever Ivy spoke to her, a soft, thoughtful smile that had not been there before the king's second visit. "You seem different today," Ivy observed carefully, arranging jars of dried herbs along the wooden shelf. "Did something happen?" Illyra considered deflecting the question as she had before, but something about the quiet morning light and Ivy's gentle curiosity made her want to speak the truth aloud, if only partially. "The king and I knew each other once, a long time ago, before either of us understood how complicated life could become." Ivy's eyes widened, though she kept her hands busy with the jars, giving Illyra the space to continue if she wished. Old Bram was right then. There really was someone. There was, Illyra admitted, and there still might be, though everything about our situation makes it difficult to know what comes next. "Do you still love him?" Ivy asked, the question direct in the way only the young dared to be. Illyra paused, considering how to answer honestly, without overwhelming the girl with complications she was too young to fully understand. "I think I never stopped, even when I tried very hard to convince myself otherwise. But love alone does not solve everything, Ivy. Sometimes duty and circumstance stand between people no matter how strong their feelings remain." Ivy nodded slowly, processing this with the seriousness of someone much older than her years suggested. "My grandmother always said that true things find their way back to each other eventually, even if the path is long and difficult." The simple wisdom struck Illyra more deeply than she expected, and she found herself smiling despite the uncertainty still weighing on her heart. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Ivy said softly. "She passed 2 winters ago, but I still remember most of what she taught me." The two worked in comfortable silence for the remainder of the morning, and Illyra found the familiar rhythm of preparing herbs and organizing supplies helping to settle her scattered thoughts. By midday, a small line of villagers had formed outside the hut, seeking treatment for various ailments, and Illyra threw herself fully into her work, grateful for the distraction it provided from the questions still circling in her mind. Later that week, word arrived through a traveling merchant that tensions along the Crimson Pack border had flared once again, a minor skirmish over grazing rights that threatened to escalate if not handled carefully. Illyra listened to the news with a growing sense of unease, understanding now, after Cale's explanation, exactly how fragile the peace between the two packs truly remained. She thought of Seraphine, the woman she had never met but now understood far better than before. A marriage built on duty rather than love, both partners quietly yearning for something the arrangement could never provide. Illyra found herself feeling an unexpected sympathy for the queen, recognizing in her situation an echo of her own suffering, though shaped by different circumstances. As the days passed without word from Cale, true to his promise to give her space, Illyra found the silence both a relief and a source of quiet longing she had not expected. She busied herself with village work, with Ivy's continued training, with the small tasks that filled her days and kept her hands occupied, even when her thoughts wandered toward the castle beyond the hills. One evening, as she walked toward the stream that had become her thinking place, she encountered old Bram, the village's elder healer who had trained her mother years before teaching Illyra herself. He sat on a fallen log near the water, watching the current with the patient stillness of someone who had lived long enough to understand the value of quiet reflection. "You've been carrying something heavy these past weeks," old Bram observed as Illyra settled onto the flat stone nearby. "I've known you since you were a child, Illyra," I can see when something troubles your spirit. The king visited, Illyra admitted, trusting old Bram's discretion after years of working alongside him. He explained things I did not know, about why he never returned all those years ago. Old Bram nodded slowly, unsurprised by the revelation. I suspected as much, when the rumors began spreading through the village. Cale was a good boy, before duty hardened him into the man he became. I always believed there was more to his disappearance than simple abandonment. Even so, it does not undo the years I spent waiting and grieving, Illyra said, her voice tight with old pain. Knowledge of the truth does not erase what was lost. No, old Bram agreed gently, but it changes how you carry the weight of it, does it not? Anger toward a man who betrayed you feels different than grief for circumstances beyond anyone's control. Illyra considered his words carefully, recognizing the wisdom in them even as uncertainty continued to churn within her. What would you do, if you were in my position? Old Bram was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the flowing water before them. I would ask myself what I truly want, separate from anger, separate from old wounds, separate even from what duty demands of either of you. Love rarely follows convenient paths, Illyra. Sometimes the bravest choice is deciding what you want for yourself, rather than what circumstances seem to dictate. His words stayed with Illyra long after she returned to her hut that night, settling into her thoughts as she prepared for sleep. She still did not know what the future held, whether friendship alone could satisfy the feelings still burning quietly beneath her careful composure, or whether some deeper reckoning waited for both her and Cale in the days ahead. But for the first time since his return to her life, she felt something close to peace, a willingness to let the situation unfold naturally, rather than forcing herself into decisions she was not yet ready to make. The castle halls felt colder than usual as Cale walked toward the private study, where his advisor waited with urgent news, his mind still lingering on the conversation he had shared with Illyra days earlier, wondering if she had reached any decision about the fragile friendship he had offered. His advisor, a steady older man named Doran who had served Cale's father before him, stood near the window with a scroll clutched tightly in his weathered hands. His expression carried none of its usual calm, a warning sign Cale recognized immediately. "What news?" Cale asked, closing the study door behind him. "Word from the border," Doran said, unrolling the scroll to reveal a hastily written message. "Corwin's men clashed with our own, near the northern grazing fields 3 days ago. No deaths, but injuries on both sides, and tempers running dangerously high." Cale's jaw tightened as he read the report himself, absorbing the details his advisor had already summarized. Was this an isolated incident, or part of a larger pattern? "Isolated for now," Doran said carefully. "But Corwin has sent word demanding compensation for what he calls unprovoked aggression from our territory. He threatens to reconsider the terms of our alliance if his demands are not addressed swiftly." Cale set the scroll down on his desk, rubbing his temples as the weight of leadership pressed down once again. 6 years of duty had taught him to separate emotion from decision-making, but the timing of this crisis, arriving so soon after his conversations with Illyra, felt like a cruel reminder of exactly how little freedom his position truly allowed. "Summon Seraphine," Cale said finally. "If Corwin threatens the alliance, she may have insight into how best to address his concerns. She understands her father's temperament better than any of us." Doran nodded and left to fetch the queen, leaving Cale alone with his thoughts for a few precious moments. He walked to the window overlooking the castle grounds, his mind drifting despite the urgency of the border crisis. He thought of Illyra's careful, guarded expression during his last visit, the way she had asked for time before deciding whether their friendship could survive the complicated truth he had shared. The study door opened again, and Seraphine entered, her posture as composed and dignified as always, though her eyes carried the same weariness Cale often felt himself. She was a striking woman, with sharp, intelligent features and a quiet strength that had earned her respect throughout the castle, even among those who knew the marriage lacked any true affection. "Doran tells me my father has grown difficult again," Seraphine said, settling into a chair across from Cale's desk without waiting for invitation, a familiarity born from 2 years of shared circumstance rather than romance. "Difficult is a generous word," Cale replied, sliding the scroll across the desk toward her. "He threatens to reconsider our alliance over a border skirmish that resulted in nothing more than minor injuries." Seraphine read the message carefully, her expression unreadable as she processed the details. My father has always used minor incidents as leverage when he wants something beyond what was originally agreed upon. This is not truly about the skirmish, Kale. This is about testing whether our alliance remains strong enough to withstand pressure. What does he want then, if not compensation for the incident itself? Kale asked. Land, Seraphine said simply. He has coveted the eastern grazing fields near Thornfield for years, territory that technically belongs to our pack, but sits close enough to the border that he believes it should be shared, if not fully surrendered. Kale's attention sharpened at the mention of Thornfield, the village where Elira lived and worked. He wants land near Thornfield specifically? The grazing fields extend close to the village boundary, yes, Seraphine confirmed, studying Kale's reaction with the sharp perception that had always made her a valuable political partner, despite the absence of romantic feeling between them. Why does that concern you more than the rest of the demand? Kale hesitated, unsure how much to reveal even to Seraphine, who had always respected the careful boundaries of their arrangement. But he had learned, through years of working alongside her, that honesty served their partnership better than secrecy, even when the truth touched on matters outside their political alliance. There is someone in Thornfield, Kale admitted finally. Someone from my past, before our marriage was arranged. I have visited her twice since returning from the northern campaigns. Seraphine's expression shifted, though not with the jealousy or anger Kale might have expected from a traditional marriage. Instead, something close to relief crossed her features, quickly masked by her usual composure. I see. And does this complicate our arrangement in any way I should be concerned about? No, Kale said carefully. I have made no promises to her beyond honesty about our situation. She understands the constraints we both face. Seraphine nodded slowly, then surprised Kale by offering a small, genuine smile, the first he had seen from her in months. Then perhaps it is time I shared something with you as well, Kale, something I have kept private since before our marriage began. Kale leaned forward, curious, despite the ongoing crisis still demanding his attention. What is it? There is a warrior in my father's guard, Seraphine said quietly, her composed exterior softening slightly as she spoke. Lucian. We grew close years before this marriage was arranged, though his rank prevented any formal courtship my family would have approved. I agreed to marry you, in part, because I understood there was no future for Lucian and myself within the constraints of my father's expectations. The confession hung in the air between them, two people bound together by duty, while their hearts remained anchored elsewhere. Kale felt a strange kinship with Seraphine in that moment, understanding fully, perhaps for the first time, the shared burden they carried together. Does he know how you feel? Kale asked. He suspects, Seraphine said. We have not spoken openly of it since my marriage began, out of respect for the arrangement, but I see the same longing in his eyes that I imagine exists in mine whenever we cross paths during diplomatic visits. Kale considered this new information carefully, his mind already working through the political implications alongside the personal ones. If your father demands land near Thornfield as compensation for the border incident, and we grant it, does that strengthen or weaken his position regarding any future changes to our marriage arrangement? Seraphine's eyes narrowed slightly, understanding the direction of his thoughts. Are you considering seeking an annulment, Kale? I don't know yet, Kale admitted honestly. But I find myself wondering whether our marriage serves any true purpose beyond the alliance itself, and whether there might be another way to secure peace between our packs that does not require either of us to remain bound to a partnership without love. That would be a dangerous path to walk, Seraphine warned, though her tone carried curiosity rather than outright rejection of the idea. My father would not easily accept an annulment without viewing it as an insult to our family's honor. It could reignite tensions we have spent 2 years trying to prevent. I understand the risk, Kale said. I am not proposing immediate action, only considering possibilities as circumstances continue to shift around us. For now, we must address the border crisis and your father's demands before any other considerations can be entertained. Seraphine nodded, rising from her chair with renewed purpose. I will draft a response to my father, offering partial concessions on the grazing fields, while making clear that continued aggression along the border will not be tolerated regardless of his demands. It should satisfy his need to appear victorious, without surrendering territory that matters to your interests. Thank you, Seraphine, Cale said, genuine gratitude coloring his voice. Your counsel has always been valuable, even within the strange circumstances of our arrangement. We have managed to build something functional out of duty, even without love, Seraphine replied, pausing at the study door. Perhaps in time, we can find a way to build something better for both of us, separate from each other, if that is truly what serves our happiness best. After she left, Cale remained alone in his study, the border crisis now layered with new personal considerations he had not anticipated when the day began. The conversation with Seraphine had shifted something fundamental in his understanding of their marriage, revealing shared unhappiness he had suspected, but never confirmed so directly. He thought again of Alira, of the careful distance she had requested, and wondered whether the timing of Corwin's demands regarding land near Thornfield was truly coincidental, or whether fate had a way of intertwining circumstances that seemed, on the surface, entirely separate. If Corwin gained influence over territory near the village, would that place Alira in any danger, drawing her further into the political complications Cale had spent years trying to shield his people from? The uncertainty gnawed at him as evening settled over the castle, and Cale found himself standing once again at the study window, watching the sun set over the hills that separated him from Thornfield, from Alira, from the life he had once imagined sharing with her before duty rewrote every plan he had carefully made. He did not know, in that quiet moment, that events were already moving beyond his control, that Corwin's demands would soon require a delegation to travel toward the border region near Thornfield itself, creating an opportunity, however dangerous, for paths that seemed impossibly separated to draw closer together once again. 3 days later, Doran returned to the study with fresh news that confirmed Cale's earlier suspicions. Corwin had rejected the initial concessions Seraphine drafted, insisting instead on a formal delegation traveling to the border region to inspect the disputed grazing fields personally before any agreement could be finalized. He wants a show of respect, Doran explained, pacing slowly before Cale's desk. A delegation sent directly from the castle, including yourself if possible, would satisfy his need to feel taken seriously. Anything less risks further escalation. Cale considered the demand carefully, weighing the political necessity against the personal complications such a journey would create. Traveling to the border region meant passing directly through Thornfield, the very village where Alira lived, and though he had promised her space and time, circumstances beyond his control seemed determined to draw him back toward her regardless of his intentions. I will lead the delegation myself, Cale decided finally. It will show Corwin the respect he demands, while allowing me to assess the situation directly, rather than relying solely on reports. A wise choice, though not without risk, Doran cautioned. Corwin's temperament remains unpredictable, and tensions along the border have not fully settled since the recent skirmish. I am aware of the risks, Cale said. Prepare a modest escort, nothing that suggests aggression, but enough to ensure safety during the journey. We leave within the week. As Doran departed to begin preparations, Cale found himself once again drawn to thoughts of Alira, wondering how she would react to his return to Thornfield so soon after promising to respect her request for distance. He told himself the journey served purely political purposes, that any encounter with Alira during the delegation's passage through the village would be coincidental rather than intentional. Yet some part of him, honest enough to acknowledge his own heart, recognized the quiet hope stirring beneath his careful justifications. Meanwhile, in Thornfield, life continued its steady rhythm, unaware of the political currents already shifting toward the village's direction. Alira spent her days treating patients, training Ivy, and slowly working through the complicated feelings Cale's visits had stirred within her. She had not sent word inviting him to return, uncertain whether she was ready to face the complications their renewed connection would inevitably bring. But neither had she fully closed the door on the possibility, keeping the small wooden bird from her youth on the shelf above her work table, a quiet reminder of promises once made beneath a summer sky. One afternoon, as she prepared herbal remedies for a family suffering from seasonal fever, a traveling merchant named Garrick arrived in the village, his cart loaded with goods from territories along the border. Garrick had passed through Thornfield many times over the years, and Alira had come to know him as a reliable source of news from beyond the village boundaries, information often more current than what reached them through official channels. There's talk of a delegation traveling from the castle, Garrick mentioned, as Alira purchased a small supply of imported spices for her remedies, heading toward the border to address tensions with the Crimson Pack. Word is the king himself plans to lead it, passing directly through this region within the week. Alira's hands stilled over the coins she had been counting, her heart quickening at the mention of Cale's imminent return. Do you know when exactly this delegation is expected to pass through? Within a few days, from what I heard at the last village, Garrick said, studying her reaction with the casual curiosity of someone who had heard rumors about the king's connection to Thornfield's healer, though he was tactful enough not to comment directly on the gossip. Seemed like an important journey, given the size of the escort accompanying him. After Garrick continued on his way, Alira remained standing in the village square for a long moment, processing the unexpected news. She had asked for time and distance, and Cale had honored that request faithfully these past weeks. But now, it seemed, political necessity would bring him back through Thornfield, regardless of either of their personal wishes, creating a collision between duty and the fragile space she had been carefully constructing around her own heart. She returned to her hut that evening with unsettled thoughts, wondering how she would react when she saw him again, whether the careful boundaries she had established would hold firm against the pull she still felt whenever he was near. Ivy noticed her distraction immediately, though she was wise enough this time not to press for details, simply offering quiet support as they finished the day's remaining tasks together. That night, as Alira lay awake staring at the wooden beams above her bed, she found herself thinking not of anger or old betrayal, but of possibility, however uncertain and complicated it remained. The truth Cale had shared, the honesty about his marriage and the political constraints binding him, had shifted something fundamental in how she understood their situation. She no longer saw him as a man who had simply abandoned her, but as someone trapped by circumstances beyond his control, still carrying feelings that mirrored her own despite years of forced separation. Whatever happened when the delegation passed through Thornfield, Alira resolved to face it with honesty, rather than the guarded defenses she had relied upon during his previous visits. She owed herself that much, after 6 years of careful walls and buried feelings finally beginning to crack under the weight of truth. Neither of them could continue denying. The delegation arrived at Thornfield's boundary, just as the sun reached its highest point, banners bearing the pack's crest fluttering above a modest but impressive escort of guards and advisors. Alira watched from a distance as the procession moved through the village, her pulse quickening despite her resolve to remain composed whenever she saw Cale again. He rode near the front, dressed formally this time, his crown catching the sunlight in a way that reminded everyone watching exactly who he was, even those who had grown accustomed to seeing him in simpler clothing during his previous visits. Beside him rode Doran, along with several unfamiliar faces Alira assumed belonged to the delegation, traveling onward to meet with Corwin's representatives. The procession stopped at the village center, and Cale dismounted, speaking briefly with the village elder about their intended path through the region, before continuing toward the border. Alira remained near her hut, uncertain whether he would seek her out during this brief stop or continue directly toward his destination, as political duty required. She did not have to wait long for her answer. Within minutes, Cale excused himself from the delegation's preparations and walked purposefully toward her hut, his expression a careful mixture of determination and uncertainty that mirrored her own feelings exactly. "I did not expect to return so soon," he said, stopping just outside her doorway, respecting the boundary she had established during their last conversation. "Circumstances beyond my control brought the delegation through Thornfield. I wanted you to hear it from me directly, rather than through village gossip." "I already heard," Alira admitted. "A merchant passed through days ago with news of your journey. I've had time to prepare myself for seeing you again, though I confess I'm still uncertain what to say." Cale nodded, understanding the honesty in her words. "I don't wish to disrupt whatever peace you've found these past weeks. If you'd prefer I continue on with the delegation, without further conversation, I will respect that." Alira studied him for a long moment, weighing her own feelings against the careful walls she had tried to maintain. Finally, she stepped back from the doorway, gesturing him inside with a small, tentative gesture. "You can stay for a few minutes. The delegation will need time to prepare, before continuing onward regardless." Cale entered, and this time the silence between them felt different than during his previous visits. less charged with old hurt, and more filled with cautious possibility. He glanced around the hut, his eyes catching on the small wooden bird resting on the shelf above her work table, and something softened in his expression at the sight of it. "You kept it," he said quietly. "I never threw it away," Elira admitted, following his gaze to the small carving. "Even during the years I told myself I hated you, I couldn't bring myself to discard it." "Elira," Cale said, taking a small step closer, though he stopped himself before crossing the remaining distance between them. "I meant what I said during my last visit. My feelings for you have never changed, despite everything that happened. But I understand if you need more time before deciding what you want moving forward." "I've thought about little else since your last visit," Elira confessed, her voice softer than she intended. "About the truth you shared, about the years we lost to circumstances beyond either of our control. I don't know if I can simply forget the pain of those years, Cale, but I also don't want to continue punishing you for choices that were never truly yours to make." Cale's expression shifted with quiet hope, though he remained cautious, unwilling to push her toward decisions she was not ready to make. "What does that mean for us, if anything?" "I don't know yet," Elira admitted honestly, "but I think I'm willing to try building something new between us, slowly, without the pressure of old expectations, or promises neither of us can currently fulfill. Friendship, as you offered, seems like a reasonable place to begin." The relief that crossed Cale's face was unmistakable, though he kept his composure, respecting the careful boundaries she had set. "I would be grateful for that, Elira. Whatever pace feels right to you." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, and Doran appeared in the doorway, his expression apologetic but urgent. "My king, the delegation is prepared to continue toward the border. Corwin's representatives are expecting our arrival before nightfall." Cale nodded, though his reluctance to leave was evident in the way his eyes lingered on Elira before he turned to follow his advisor outside. "I must go, but I hope we can continue this conversation upon my return from the border negotiations." "I would like that," Elira said, surprising herself with the genuine warmth in her voice. As Cale prepared to remount his horse, a commotion arose near the edge of the village, drawing the attention of the entire delegation. A rider approached at full speed, dust rising behind his mount, clearly carrying urgent news that could not wait for the delegation's planned arrival at the border. The rider, a young scout Elira did not recognize, pulled his horse to a stop before Cale, breathing heavily from the hard ride. "My king, there's been an incident at the border. Corwin's men engaged with our patrol near the disputed grazing fields. Injuries on both sides, though nothing fatal. Corwin claims provocation and demands immediate explanation before he'll agree to continue negotiations." Cale's expression hardened with the weight of renewed crisis, all traces of the softer moment shared with Elira moments earlier, replaced by the sharp focus leadership demanded. "How severe are the injuries?" "Serious enough that our healers at the border camp are struggling to manage the casualties," the scout reported. "They've requested additional medical support if any can be spared." Elira, who had been listening from her doorway, stepped forward without hesitation, her healer's instincts overriding any personal uncertainty about the timing of the crisis. "I can help. I've treated worse injuries than what you're describing, and Thornfield's proximity to the border means I could reach the camp faster than support traveling from the castle." Cale turned to her, surprise and concern warring in his expression. "Elira, the border region remains dangerous, given the current tensions. I cannot ask you to risk yourself for a crisis that has nothing to do with you." "You're not asking," Elira said firmly, already moving to gather her healing supplies. "I'm offering. Injured people need treatment, regardless of politics, Cale. This is exactly the kind of situation I trained my entire life to handle." Doran stepped forward, recognizing the practical value of her offer, despite Cale's hesitation. "My king, a skilled healer traveling with the delegation, could prove valuable, both for treating the injured and for demonstrating our commitment to resolving this situation swiftly and honorably. It might also ease tensions with Corwin's people, if they see we bring healing rather than aggression." Cale considered the practical wisdom in Doran's assessment, though his personal reluctance to expose Elira to potential danger remained evident in his tightened jaw. Finally he nodded, understanding that both duty and Elira's own determination left him little room to refuse. "Gather what you need quickly," he said. "We ride within the hour." Elira moved swiftly through her hut, packing bandages, salves, and herbs into a sturdy leather satchel, while Ivy, who had rushed over upon hearing the commotion, watched with wide, worried eyes. "Are you certain about this?" Ivy asked, helping gather supplies from the shelves. "The border sounds dangerous, especially with tensions already running high." "I'm certain," Elira said, tying the satchel closed with steady hands, despite the nervous energy coursing through her. "People need help, Ivy. That matters more than my own uncertainty about what waits for me at the border." Within the hour, Elira found herself mounted on a spare horse provided by the delegation, riding alongside Kale and his escort toward the border region she had never visited, carrying supplies that might mean the difference between life and death for soldiers caught in a conflict neither of them had chosen. The wind carried the scent of approaching autumn as they rode, and despite the uncertainty and danger ahead, Elira felt a strange sense of purpose settling over her, as if the path she had spent 6 years avoiding was finally, inevitably, drawing her forward into whatever future waited beyond the hills. Beside her, Kale rode with quiet vigilance, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of further trouble, though his thoughts remained partly fixed on the woman riding beside him, wondering how their fragile new understanding would survive the trials that awaited them at the volatile border between two packs still struggling to maintain a peace built on convenience rather than trust. The ride to the border camp took nearly 3 hours, the landscape shifting from familiar farmland to rockier terrain, marked by watchtowers and patrol paths that spoke to years of tension along the boundary line. As they crested a final hill, the camp came into view below, a cluster of tents surrounding a central fire pit, with several figures moving urgently between the makeshift medical shelter and the rows of wounded soldiers laid out on blankets. Elira dismounted quickly once they reached the camp, her training taking over immediately as she assessed the scene before her. A young healer, clearly overwhelmed by the number of casualties, looked up with visible relief when she approached. "Thank the stars," the young healer said, wiping sweat from his brow. "We have 12 wounded, 3 with injuries serious enough to need more skilled attention than I can provide alone. I've done what I can, but I'm not trained for wounds this severe." "Show me," Elira said, already rolling up her sleeves and moving toward the nearest patient, a young soldier with a deep gash along his side that had been hastily bandaged but continued to bleed through the cloth. She worked quickly and efficiently, cleaning the wound properly before applying pressure and a fresh dressing infused with herbs known to prevent infection and promote faster healing. The soldier winced but remained still, trusting her steady hands as she worked. Behind her, she could hear Kale speaking in low, urgent tones with the camp's commanding officer, gathering details about the skirmish and assessing what response the situation required. Moving from patient to patient, Elira treated broken bones, deep cuts, and one particularly concerning case of a soldier struggling to breathe properly due to a blow to his chest during the fighting. She worked without pause for nearly 2 hours, her focus entirely absorbed by the practical demands of healing, grateful for the way the work kept her mind from dwelling too heavily on the complicated emotions still swirling beneath the surface of her concentration. As dusk began settling over the camp, Elira finally finished treating the last of the seriously injured soldiers, her hands stained with dried blood and herbs, her body aching with exhaustion from the sustained effort. She stepped outside the medical tent for a moment of fresh air, only to find Kale waiting nearby, having clearly been watching for the moment she finished her work. "You saved lives today," he said quietly, offering her a water skin, which she accepted gratefully, drinking deeply before responding. "I did what any trained healer would do," she said, though the exhaustion in her voice carried a note of quiet pride at the work accomplished. "How did the negotiations with Corwin's representatives proceed?" "Tense, but manageable," Kale said. "Seeing our healers treating both our soldiers and 2 of Corwin's men, who were also injured during the skirmish, helped ease some of the hostility. It demonstrated good faith in a way words alone could not have accomplished." Elira looked up at him, surprised. "You had me treat soldiers from both sides?" "I asked the camp's commanding officer to extend the offer," Kale admitted. "It seemed important, given the delicate nature of the peace we're trying to maintain, to show that healing extends beyond loyalty to one pack or another. I hope that wasn't presumptuous of me." "It wasn't," Elira said, genuinely touched by the gesture. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that might actually hold this peace together, rather than simply managing crisis after crisis as they arise. They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the camp settle into evening routines around them, soldiers from both sides moving cautiously but without open hostility, as the immediate crisis began to ease. The shared experience of the day, the danger and urgency of treating the wounded, had created a bond between them that felt different from their previous careful conversations, forged instead through action and shared purpose, rather than words alone. "We should rest," Cale said finally. "The delegation will need to continue formal negotiations with Corwin's representatives tomorrow, and you should recover your strength after everything you accomplished today." Alira nodded, suddenly aware of how tired she truly felt after the long ride and hours of intensive healing work. As they walked together toward the tents prepared for the delegation's use, she found herself grateful, despite the danger and complexity of the day, for the opportunity to see Cale in this new context, not as the king who had once broken her heart, but as a leader, genuinely committed to preventing further suffering among his people, willing to use whatever resources available, including her own skills, to build something more lasting than temporary peace. That night, as she settled into the small tent provided for her use, Alira found sleep eluding her despite her exhaustion, her mind replaying the day's events and the quiet moments shared with Cale amid the chaos of treating the wounded. Whatever remained uncertain about their future, she recognized something important had shifted between them at the border camp. A foundation built not on old promises or nostalgic memories, but on witnessing each other's true character during a moment that demanded honesty and courage from them both. Outside her tent, Cale remained awake as well, standing watch near the camp's edge, his thoughts equally consumed by the day's events and the woman whose skill and courage had impressed him more deeply than he expected, even after years of believing he already understood the full measure of her character. Whatever challenges awaited them in the coming days of negotiation with Corwin's representatives, he found himself facing them with renewed determination, knowing now, more certainly than ever, that the future he wanted required finding a way past the political constraints still binding him to a marriage without love. Morning arrived at the border camp with a tension that had not existed the previous evening, as word spread that Corwin himself intended to arrive personally for the negotiations, rather than sending representatives as originally planned. Cale received the news with careful composure, though Alira noticed the slight tightening of his shoulders that betrayed his concern about facing the Crimson Pack's formidable leader directly. Corwin rarely travels for negotiations he considers beneath his personal attention, Doran explained, as the delegation prepared for the day ahead. His decision to come himself suggests he views this matter as more significant than a simple border dispute. Or he wants to assess the situation directly, given the injuries on both sides, Cale offered, though his tone suggested he shared Doran's underlying concern about the shift in circumstances. Alira, who had spent the morning checking on her patients from the previous day, found their conditions improved enough that most could be moved to less intensive care, freeing her to observe the political proceedings that would unfold as Corwin arrived. She positioned herself near the medical tent, close enough to witness events without directly involving herself in matters clearly outside her expertise. Corwin's arrival came shortly after midday, his procession considerably larger than Cale's delegation, banners bearing the Crimson Pack's insignia, creating an imposing display as they approached the camp. Corwin himself rode at the front, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and sharp, calculating eyes that swept across the camp with obvious assessment of the situation before him. "Alpha King Cale," Corwin said as he dismounted, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a leader accustomed to commanding respect. "I trust you understand the seriousness of what has occurred along our shared border." "I understand it fully," Cale replied, meeting Corwin's gaze with steady confidence, despite the older leader's imposing presence. "Which is why I brought healers to treat the wounded from both sides, and why I stand ready to discuss fair resolution to whatever concerns brought us to this point." Corwin's eyes flickered briefly toward the medical tent, where several of his own soldiers still recovered from injuries sustained during the skirmish. "I heard reports that your healer treated my men alongside your own, without distinction or hesitation." "She did," Cale confirmed. "Healing should not recognize borders, Corwin, particularly when the injuries occurred through circumstances neither of us fully control." The Crimson Pack leader studied Cale for a long moment, something shifting behind his calculating eyes that Alira, watching from a distance, could not fully interpret. Finally, Corwin gestured toward a large tent that had been prepared for formal negotiations. Let us discuss this matter properly then, rather than continuing to exchange words in the open camp. As the leaders and their advisors moved toward the negotiation tent, Elira returned her attention to her patients, though her mind remained partly focused on the discussions taking place nearby, understanding that whatever agreement emerged would significantly impact not just the border region, but potentially her own future given Cale's earlier consideration of seeking an annulment from his marriage to Seraphine. The negotiations continued for several hours, with occasional raised voices carrying faintly from the tent, though nothing that suggested complete breakdown of the discussions. Elira used the time productively, checking on her patients and preparing additional supplies in case the negotiations required extended presence at the camp. Late in the afternoon, Doran emerged from the negotiation tent, seeking out Elira with an expression that suggested both relief and continued caution. The negotiations have reached a tentative agreement, he reported. Corwin has agreed to shared grazing rights along the disputed fields, rather than demanding full surrender of the territory. In exchange, we've agreed to additional trade concessions that should satisfy his economic interests without compromising our own. That sounds like a reasonable resolution, Elira said, relief evident in her voice. It is, though Corwin insisted on one additional condition before finalizing the agreement, Doran continued, his expression growing more serious. He wishes to speak with you directly. Elira's surprise was evident. With me? Why would the leader of the Crimson Pack want to speak with a village healer? He was impressed by your willingness to treat his soldiers without hesitation, Doran explained. He believes such gestures matter for building lasting trust between our peoples, beyond the formal agreements reached through negotiation. He wishes to thank you personally and discuss the possibility of establishing a more permanent healing exchange between our territories. Curious and somewhat apprehensive, Elira followed Doran toward the negotiation tent, where Cale and Corwin waited along with several advisors from both delegations. Corwin rose as she entered, his expression considerably warmer than the calculating demeanor he had displayed upon his arrival at the camp. Healer Elira, Corwin said, extending a formal greeting that surprised her with its genuine respect. I wish to thank you personally for the care you provided my soldiers yesterday. Your skill and impartiality reflect well on the Alpha King's territory, and I believe such gestures of goodwill matter more than formal treaties alone. I simply did what my training required, Elira replied modestly, though she appreciated the acknowledgement. Any healer worth their training would have done the same, regardless of which pack the injured belonged to. Perhaps, Corwin said, though his tone suggested he believed her response understated the significance of her actions. Nonetheless, I would like to propose something to accompany our formal agreement regarding the border territory. A regular exchange of healers between our regions, allowing skilled practitioners like yourself to share knowledge and provide care across both territories, particularly in border villages like Thornfield, that sit close enough to benefit from such cooperation. The proposal intrigued Elira, though she glanced toward Cale, uncertain whether such an arrangement fell within her authority to accept, or whether it required more formal consideration from the leadership of both packs. Cale, seeming to understand her hesitation, offered a small, encouraging nod. I believe such an exchange would benefit both our peoples greatly, Cale said. If Healer Elira is willing to help establish the initial framework for this cooperation, I would fully support the arrangement. Elira considered the proposal seriously, recognizing both the practical value it offered and the personal complications it might create, given her already complicated relationship with the Alpha King proposing to support the initiative. Still, the opportunity to expand her healing work, to build genuine cooperation between two peoples who had spent years locked in tension, felt too significant to dismiss due to personal uncertainty. I would be honored to help establish such an exchange, she said finally, though I would want to ensure Thornfield remains adequately served during any periods I might travel to assist with training or treatment in Crimson Pack territory. A reasonable concern, Corwin agreed. Perhaps your apprentice could manage the village's needs during shorter absences, with additional support arranged for longer training periods if necessary. The conversation continued for another hour, details of the proposed healing exchange taking shape alongside the formal border agreement Cale and Corwin had already negotiated. By the time the discussions concluded, Elira found herself both exhausted and unexpectedly energized by the possibilities the day had revealed. A path forward that extended beyond her personal complications with Kale into something that might genuinely benefit both territories for years to come. As the negotiation tent emptied and preparations began for Corwin's departure back toward Crimson Pact territory, Kale found a quiet moment to speak with Alira privately, away from the attention of advisors and soldiers still finalizing details of the day's agreements. "You handled that beautifully," he said, genuine admiration evident in his voice. Corwin rarely extends such respect to anyone outside his own pack, let alone proposes formal cooperation on his own initiative. "I think the border crisis, difficult as it was, may have created an opportunity neither of us expected," Alira replied thoughtfully. "Sometimes the most meaningful progress comes from unexpected circumstances, rather than careful planning alone." Kale studied her for a long moment, something warm and hopeful crossing his features despite the exhaustion evident from the day's demanding negotiations. "I find myself grateful for many unexpected circumstances these past weeks, Alira. Your presence here, your willingness to help despite everything unresolved between us, has meant more than I know how to properly express." Alira felt heat rise to her cheeks, though she did not look away from his sincere gaze. "We still have much to figure out between us, Kale. This healing exchange doesn't solve the complications of your marriage, or the political constraints still binding your choices." "No, it doesn't," Kale agreed, "but it gives us reason to remain connected, to build something meaningful together, even while those larger complications remain unresolved. Perhaps that's enough for now, a foundation to build upon as we navigate whatever comes next." As the sun began setting over the border camp, casting long shadows across the tents, and remaining soldiers preparing for the delegation's eventual return journey, Alira found herself cautiously optimistic about the future, for the first time since Kale's unexpected return to her life weeks earlier. Whatever challenges remained, the day's events had demonstrated that they could build something valuable together, whether as cautious friends navigating complicated circumstances, or as something deeper still, waiting to fully emerge from the careful boundaries they had both maintained. The delegation departed the border camp early the following morning, the formal agreement with Corwin secured, and the remaining wounded soldiers stable enough to continue their recovery, without Alira's constant supervision. The young healer who had first greeted her at the camp promised to send word if any complications arose, and Alira left detailed instructions for continuing care, grateful that her intervention had likely prevented more serious outcomes for several of the soldiers. The ride back toward Thornfield felt different than the urgent journey that had brought them to the border days earlier, where before the group had traveled with tense purpose, racing against the uncertainty of injuries and unresolved conflict. The return journey carried a lighter atmosphere, punctuated by quiet conversation and the shared relief of crisis successfully navigated. Alira found herself riding beside Kale for much of the journey, their conversation flowing more easily than it had during any of their previous encounters since his return to her life. They spoke of small things at first, the changing colors of the autumn leaves along the path, memories of childhood before duty and circumstance had separated them, the quiet satisfaction of work well done during the crisis at the border camp. Corwin mentioned before we left that he intends to send a formal envoy to discuss the healing exchange in greater detail within the month, Kale mentioned as they crossed a shallow stream partway through their journey. He seemed genuinely impressed by the potential benefits, beyond simple diplomatic gesture. "I'm looking forward to it," Alira admitted, "though I confess some nervousness about training healers, from a territory I know so little about. Our methods may differ more than either of us expects." "I have confidence in your ability to navigate those differences," Kale said, glancing toward her with warm admiration evident in his expression. "You handled yesterday's negotiations, and Corwin's respect, with more grace than most seasoned diplomats could manage." Alira laughed softly, the sound surprising even herself after the tension of recent weeks. "I simply spoke honestly about my work, Kale. There was no particular strategy involved, beyond caring for the people who needed help." "Perhaps that's exactly why it works so well," Kale observed. "Honesty tends to succeed where careful political maneuvering often fails, particularly with someone like Corwin, who has spent years navigating deception and manipulation from various directions." As they continued their journey, the conversation gradually shifted toward more personal territory, both of them navigating the careful balance between honesty and the boundaries Alira had established regarding the pace of whatever relationship might develop between them. Kale spoke more openly than before about the loneliness of his position, the weight of leadership without a true partner to share the burden, while Alira shared stories of her years building her healing practice in Thornfield, the satisfaction and occasional isolation of dedicating herself so fully to her work. By the time Thornfield's familiar boundaries came into view late that afternoon, something had settled comfortably between them, a friendship rebuilding itself on foundations far sturdier than nostalgia or old promises alone. Ivy rushed out to greet them as the delegation arrived at the village center, her relief at Alira's safe return evident in the tight embrace she offered, before stepping back to properly acknowledge the Alpha King's presence. The village has been anxious since word arrived about the border conflict, Ivy explained, glancing between Alira and Kale, with obvious curiosity about the dynamic now visible between them. I'm relieved to see you both return safely. Alira's skills saved several lives at the border camp, Kale said, genuine pride evident in his voice, as he addressed the young apprentice. Thornfield should be proud of the healer you're training alongside. Ivy beamed at the praise, though her eyes remained curious about the warmth now evident between her teacher and the king, questions she wisely chose not to voice directly in the busy village square. As the delegation began preparations to continue toward the castle, Kale lingered near Alira's hut, reluctant to conclude their journey together so soon after the closeness that had developed during their travels. I should return to the castle, given the agreements requiring formal documentation, and the need to inform Seraphine of the border resolution. Of course, Alira said, understanding the demands of his position, even as part of her wish the journey could have continued longer. Thank you, Kale, for trusting me with the border camp's care, and for supporting the healing exchange with Corwin's people. Thank you for reminding me what genuine partnership looks like, Kale replied quietly, his eyes holding hers with unmistakable warmth. I hope, whatever pace feels right to you, that we might continue building whatever this has become between us. I would like that, Alira said softly, surprising herself with how easily the words came after weeks of careful guardedness. Kale smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his usually composed features into something younger, more like the man she had loved before duty and circumstance had hardened him into the king he had become. Then I will find reason to return soon, though I promise this time to be honest about my intentions from the start. As the delegation departed toward the castle, Alira watched until the last banner disappeared over the horizon, her heart carrying a lightness she had not experienced in years, tempered still by the knowledge that significant complications remained unresolved between them. Whatever came next, she felt ready to face it with the same honesty and courage that had carried her through the crisis at the border camp, trusting that whatever future awaited them would be built on truth rather than the careful evasions and forced circumstances that had kept them apart for far too long. 2 weeks passed peacefully after the delegation's return from the border, and Alira found herself settling into a rhythm that felt lighter than any period since Kale's initial return to her life. She continued her work in Thornfield, prepared materials for the upcoming healing exchange with Corwin's territory, and found her thoughts drifting toward the castle more often than she cared to admit. Then came the morning a familiar rider approached the village, this time not part of a full delegation, but a single guard escorting Kale alone, his horse favoring one leg slightly as they approached her hut. Another injury? Alira asked, arms crossed as she watched him dismount, though the corner of her mouth twitched with barely suppressed amusement. A hunting accident, Kale said, his expression carefully serious despite the obvious flimsiness of the excuse. My ankle twisted awkwardly during a pursuit through rough terrain. Alira raised an eyebrow, gesturing him toward the familiar stool near her work table. The Alpha King, injured twice within 2 months, both times conveniently requiring treatment from the same village healer. Should I be concerned about your hunting skills, or is there perhaps another explanation I should consider? Kale settled onto the stool, extending his leg for her examination, with an expression that held no real attempt at deception. Perhaps I simply find excuses insufficient when honesty would serve just as well. I wanted to see you, Alira. The ankle provided a reasonable justification for the journey, even if the injury itself proved less severe than I initially claimed to my advisors. You lied to your own advisors to visit me? Alira asked, though her tone carried more warmth than judgment as she knelt to examine his ankle, finding, as she suspected, only minor swelling that hardly justified a royal visit. I told them I needed rest and treatment before continuing my duties, Kale clarified. Not entirely a lie, given the genuine benefit I find in these visits, even if the physical injury itself remains modest. Illyra shook her head, though she could not fully suppress her smile, as she wrapped his ankle with practiced efficiency. You realize this pattern cannot continue indefinitely. Eventually someone will question why the king seems to injure himself so frequently, always requiring the same healer's attention. Let them question it, Kale said, his voice softening as he watched her work. I've spent enough years hiding my true feelings behind duty and careful political calculation. If visiting you requires occasional creative excuses, I find myself increasingly unwilling to care what conclusions others might draw. The vulnerability in his admission touched Illyra more deeply than she expected, and she found herself pausing in her work to meet his gaze directly. Kale, we agreed to build this slowly, to focus on friendship while the larger complications of your marriage remain unresolved. I worry that these visits, however welcome, are moving faster than either of us can properly manage given everything still standing between us. You're right to worry, Kale acknowledged, though he did not look away from her steady gaze. But I find myself unable to stay away, Illyra. These weeks apart have only confirmed what I already suspected, that whatever feelings remained between us have only grown stronger since our reconnection, regardless of the careful pace we agreed upon. Illyra finished securing the bandage and rose to her feet, needing the small physical distance to gather her thoughts properly. I feel the same pull, Kale. I won't pretend otherwise, but feelings alone cannot resolve the practical complications still facing us. Your marriage to Seraphine remains unresolved, and any deeper involvement between us risks consequences neither of us can fully predict. I understand the risks, Kale said, rising carefully, despite his supposedly injured ankle, closing the small distance between them with deliberate slowness that gave her time to step back if she wished. She did not. But I've spent 6 years allowing duty and circumstance to dictate my choices regarding you, Illyra. I find myself increasingly unwilling to continue that pattern, regardless of the complications it might create. They stood close together, closer than propriety or careful boundaries might have suggested, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings both had tried carefully to manage since his return to her life. Illyra felt her resolve wavering, the careful walls she had maintained throughout their renewed connection weakening under the intensity of his presence so near her own. "What are you asking of me, Kale?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet hut. "I'm not asking anything you're not ready to give," Kale said softly. "I only wanted you to know the truth of my feelings, without pretense or careful political calculation. Whatever you decide about how we move forward, I trust your judgment completely." The moment stretched between them, filled with possibility and uncertainty in equal measure, until the sound of approaching footsteps outside the hut broke the tension, forcing both of them to step back, with the practiced composure of people accustomed to hiding their true feelings from public view. Ivy entered moments later, carrying a basket of freshly gathered herbs, her eyes widening slightly at the charged atmosphere she had clearly interrupted, though she said nothing, simply setting her basket down and busying herself with sorting the day's harvest. "I should let you rest that ankle," Illyra said, her voice steadier than she felt, though color remained high in her cheeks. "Perhaps limit your hunting excursions to safer terrain in the future, my king." Kale's mouth curved with barely suppressed amusement at her careful formality, understanding the need to re-establish composure in front of her apprentice. "I will certainly take your advice under consideration, Healer Illyra. Thank you for your continued care." He departed shortly after, though not before catching her eye once more, a silent promise passing between them that this conversation, however incomplete, marked a significant shift in the careful boundaries they had established. As his procession disappeared down the eastern road, Illyra remained standing in her doorway for a long moment, processing the intensity of feelings the brief encounter had stirred within her. Ivy, unable to contain her curiosity any longer, finally spoke up from where she continued sorting herbs. That seemed like more than a simple ankle injury conversation. Illyra sighed, running a hand through her hair as she turned back toward the hut, needing the familiar routine of her work to settle her scattered thoughts. "It was complicated, Ivy. More complicated than I know how to properly explain right now." "You care for him deeply," Ivy observed, not as a question, but as simple recognition of what she had witnessed. "And he clearly cares for you as well. Why does that need to be complicated?" Because he's married, Elira said simply, though the weight of the admission carried far more complexity than the simple statement suggested. Even if the marriage lacks love, even if circumstances forced it upon him, that doesn't erase the vow he made to another woman. I won't be responsible for breaking a marriage, regardless of my own feelings. Ivy considered this carefully, her young mind working through the moral complexity, with more wisdom than her years might have suggested. But what if breaking it is what everyone involved truly wants? What if staying in a marriage without love causes more harm than ending it honestly? Elira had no immediate answer for the girl's perceptive question, recognizing the validity in her reasoning even as her own careful moral boundaries resisted the idea of encouraging Cale towards such a significant decision. I don't know, Ivy. That's not a choice I can make for him, or for Seraphine. It has to come from them, from their own understanding of what serves their happiness and their duty to their people. The conversation settled into quiet contemplation as they continued their work, though Elira's thoughts remained fixed on the charged moment shared with Cale. The growing certainty that whatever careful boundaries she tried to maintain, their connection continued deepening regardless of the practical complications still standing firmly between them. She wondered, as evening settled over Thornfield, whether Cale's supposedly injured ankle would heal quickly enough to prevent another visit, or whether, as she suspected, another excuse would soon bring him back to her doorway, drawn by feelings neither of them seemed able to fully control despite their best efforts at careful, measured distance. In the days that followed, Elira noticed a subtle shift in how the villagers of Thornfield regarded her. Where once she had simply been the respected healer who tended their wounds and illnesses, whispers now followed her through the market square, curious glances lingering a moment too long whenever she passed. The king's repeated visits, impossible to hide in a village as small and close-knit as Thornfield, had become the subject of constant speculation. They say he comes every few weeks now. She overheard an older woman named Rosalind telling a group gathered near the well, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, that Elira stood close enough to hear every word. Always some injury or another, always requiring the healer's personal attention. My husband thinks it strange that a king's guard cannot handle a simple wound treatment on their own. Perhaps the healer possesses skills beyond ordinary treatment, another woman suggested, her tone carrying obvious insinuation that made Elira's cheeks flush with embarrassed heat. She continued walking, without acknowledging the conversation, though the words followed her long after she returned to the privacy of her hut. She understood the villagers meant no true malice in their gossip, simply the natural curiosity of small communities faced with unusual circumstances, but the growing attention still troubled her, particularly given the complicated truth underlying the speculation. That evening, Old Bram visited her hut, ostensibly to discuss supplies for the upcoming winter season, though Elira suspected his true purpose extended beyond practical village matters. He settled onto the familiar stool, watching her with the patient, knowing expression she had come to associate with his deeper wisdom. The village talks more than usual these days, he observed, without preamble, about the king's visits, about what they might mean beyond simple coincidence. I'm aware, Elira said, continuing to organize her supplies, rather than meeting his gaze directly. There's little I can do to stop the speculation, given how frequently he's visited these past months. Does the speculation trouble you? Old Bram asked. It complicates things, Elira admitted. Cale is married, regardless of the circumstances surrounding that marriage. If word of these visits reaches Queen Seraphine in a way that suggests impropriety, it could create serious complications, not just for us personally, but for the fragile peace being built between our territories and the Crimson Pack. Old Bram nodded slowly, considering her words with the careful thoughtfulness that had made him such a respected figure within the village. Perhaps it's time to consider what you truly want from this situation, Elira, rather than simply reacting to circumstances as they arise. Cale clearly cares for you deeply, given the risks he continues taking to see you. The question remains whether you're prepared to accept whatever complications might arise from encouraging that connection further, or whether it would be wiser to establish clearer boundaries before matters progress beyond your control. I don't know what I want, Elira confessed, setting down the jar she had been holding to fully face her old mentor. Part of me wants nothing more than to build a future with him, to finally claim the life we once planned together before duty tore us apart. But another part fears the consequences, both for myself and for Seraphine, who never asked to be caught in this complicated situation any more than I did. Have you considered speaking with her directly? Old Bram asked, the suggestion catching Alira off guard. With Seraphine? I've never even met her. Perhaps that's precisely why the situation feels so complicated, Old Bram said gently. You've built an image of her in your mind, imagined her as an obstacle or a victim, without ever understanding her true feelings about her own marriage. Sometimes clarity comes not from avoiding difficult conversations, but from facing them directly, however uncomfortable that might prove. Alira considered his words carefully, recognizing the wisdom in them, even as the idea of meeting Seraphine face to face filled her with considerable apprehension. What would she even say to the woman whose husband had spent months finding excuses to visit another healer's hut? How could such a conversation possibly proceed without awkwardness or potential hostility? I'll think about it, she said finally, though she made no immediate commitment to pursuing such a meeting. After Old Bram left, Alira sat alone in her hut for a long time, watching the candlelight flicker across the familiar walls that had served as both her sanctuary and, increasingly, the center of complications she had never anticipated when Cale first returned to her life. The growing village gossip, Old Bram's suggestion about speaking with Seraphine directly, the intensity of feeling shared during Cale's last visit despite his supposedly minor ankle injury, all of it swirled together into a tangle of uncertainty that left her more unsettled than she had felt in weeks. She thought of Ivy's simple question from earlier that day, why something built on genuine care needed to remain so complicated, and found herself without a satisfying answer. Perhaps Old Bram was right. Perhaps clarity required facing the situation directly, rather than continuing to navigate around its edges, however uncomfortable and uncertain that path might prove to be. As she finally prepared for sleep that night, Alira made a quiet decision. The next time circumstances brought her anywhere near the castle, whether through the healing exchange negotiations with Corwin's people or some other opportunity, she would find a way to meet Seraphine directly, to understand the true nature of the marriage complicating her own feelings for Cale, and perhaps, through that difficult conversation, find the clarity that continued to elude her through careful avoidance alone. B. Queen Seraphine stood before the tall mirror in her private chambers, studying her reflection with the critical eye she had learned to apply to every aspect of her public presentation since becoming Cale's wife 2 years earlier. Behind her, a servant adjusted the folds of her formal gown, preparing her for the evening council meeting, where reports from the border negotiations would be formally presented to the full assembly of advisors and pack leaders. She had heard the rumors, of course. A castle as large as this one could not contain secrets for long, and the whispers about Cale's frequent visits to a border village healer had reached her chambers weeks earlier, carried through servants who assumed their queen either did not know or did not care about her husband's activities beyond the castle walls. The truth was more complicated than either assumption suggested. Seraphine knew precisely why Cale traveled so frequently to Thornfield, understood the history between him and the healer named Alira, and felt none of the jealousy or betrayal a traditional wife might experience upon learning such information. If anything, she felt a strange kinship with the situation, recognizing in Cale's quiet longing for another woman the same ache she carried for Lucian, the warrior whose company she had been denied by circumstances of rank and family expectation. Still, the growing speculation troubled her, not from personal hurt, but from political concern about how such rumors might affect the fragile alliance her marriage had been designed to secure. If Corwin heard whispers suggesting the Alpha King pursued relationships outside his marriage, however honest the underlying circumstances, it could provide exactly the kind of leverage her father might use to further destabilize the peace they had all worked so carefully to establish. That evening, following the council meeting where the border agreement was formally ratified and plans for the healing exchange with Corwin's territory were discussed in detail, Seraphine found a private moment to speak with Cale, away from the attention of advisors and servants. "The healer you brought to treat the wounded at the border camp," she said carefully, watching his reaction closely. "The one now proposed to lead the healing exchange initiative. That would be Alira, I presume." Cale's expression remained carefully composed, though Seraphine had learned over 2 years of marriage to read the subtle signs beneath his practiced neutrality. Yes, her skill proved invaluable during the crisis, and her rapport with Corwin's people helped ease the negotiations considerably. "I've heard other things as well," Seraphine continued, choosing her words carefully. "Rumors about your visits to Thornfield, more frequent than official duties would typically require. Kale met her gaze directly, understanding that continued evasion would serve neither of them well, given the honest foundation they had built within their unconventional marriage. The rumors are accurate, Seraphine. I've visited Thornfield several times these past months, ostensibly for minor injuries that required far less urgent attention than I claimed. I see, Seraphine said, though her tone carried curiosity rather than accusation. And what precisely do these visits mean for our arrangement, if I may ask directly? Kale considered his answer carefully, recognizing the importance of honesty in this conversation, given everything Seraphine had shared with him regarding her own feelings for Lucian. I don't yet know fully, Seraphine. My feelings for Alira never truly faded, despite the years and circumstances that separated us. Since reconnecting with her, those feelings have only grown stronger, though we've both tried to proceed carefully, given the complications our situation presents. Do you love her? Seraphine asked directly, the question carrying no jealousy, only genuine curiosity about a situation that mirrored her own unfulfilled longing. Yes, Kale admitted without hesitation. I never stopped loving her, even during our own marriage ceremony, even as I tried to honor the duty that arrangement represented. Seraphine nodded slowly, absorbing this confirmation of what she had already suspected. Then perhaps it's time we spoke honestly about what we both truly want, Kale, beyond the political necessity that first brought us together. I've carried my own feelings for Lucian throughout our marriage, feelings I've never acted upon out of respect for our arrangement and the peace it maintains between our peoples. I'm aware, Kale said gently. You told me as much during our earlier conversation about the border tensions. What I haven't told you, Seraphine continued, her composed exterior showing rare vulnerability, is how much that restraint has cost me, watching him serve within my father's guard, knowing we can never claim the future we might have shared under different circumstances. I find myself wondering whether our marriage, however politically necessary, truly serves either of our happiness in the way it was originally intended. The admission hung between them, heavy with implications neither had previously voiced so directly despite their shared understanding of the marriage's true nature. Kale studied his wife carefully, recognizing the courage required for such honesty. What are you suggesting, Seraphine? I'm suggesting we consider whether there might be a path forward that allows both of us to pursue genuine happiness, without necessarily destroying the political alliance our marriage was designed to secure, Seraphine said carefully. Yeah, perhaps an annulment, handled with appropriate diplomatic care, could actually strengthen rather than weaken the relationship between our territories, if approached correctly. Kale's surprise was evident, though beneath it stirred a cautious hope he had not allowed himself to fully embrace, since his conversations with Alira began revealing the depth of feeling still connecting them. You would consider that, despite the risk to the alliance, despite your father's likely reaction to such a proposal. I've spent 2 years watching us both quietly suffer within an arrangement neither of us truly wanted, beyond its political necessity, Seraphine said. I love my people, and I understand the importance of the peace our marriage helped secure, but I no longer believe that peace requires our continued unhappiness as its foundation. There must be another way to maintain what we've built together, one that doesn't require either of us to sacrifice genuine happiness indefinitely. They spoke for nearly an hour that evening, carefully considering the political implications of pursuing an annulment, the various approaches that might minimize risk to the alliance, while allowing both of them to finally pursue the relationships their hearts truly desired. Seraphine suggested framing any potential annulment, not as rejection or failure, but as mutual recognition that their partnership, while valuable politically, had run its natural course, with both parties amicably choosing to pursue separate paths, while maintaining the underlying friendship and cooperation between their territories. Corwin will need careful handling, Seraphine cautioned. He values tradition and honor above most other considerations. An annulment framed poorly could easily be interpreted as insult, regardless of our true intentions. Perhaps the healing exchange provides an opportunity, Kale suggested, his mind already working through possible strategies. If we can demonstrate that our territories remain committed to cooperation and mutual benefit through initiatives like the exchange, independent of the marriage itself, it might ease concerns about the alliance's stability should we proceed with an annulment. That's a reasonable approach, Seraphine agreed, though we should proceed carefully, perhaps waiting until the healing exchange has proven successful, before raising the more delicate matter of ending our formal marriage. As their conversation concluded, both of them carrying cautious hope for futures they had not allowed themselves to fully imagine during the constrained years of their political marriage. Seraphine found herself reflecting on the strange path that had led to this moment. She had expected, upon learning of Cale's visits to Elira, to feel threatened or betrayed. Instead, she felt something closer to gratitude, recognizing that his happiness, pursued honestly, rather than through continued suppression of true feeling, might finally provide the opening she needed to pursue her own long-suppressed connection with Lucian. That night, alone in her chambers after Cale had departed to attend to other castle matters, Seraphine found herself composing a careful letter to Lucian, the first direct communication she had allowed herself to send him since her marriage began. She wrote cautiously, hinting at possibilities without making promises she could not yet guarantee, but the simple act of reaching out after years of careful distance filled her with a hope she had almost forgotten how to feel. Meanwhile, in Thornfield, unaware of the significant conversation unfolding within the castle walls, Elira continued her preparations for the upcoming healing exchange, her thoughts returning frequently to old Bram's suggestion that she seek out Seraphine directly. She did not yet know that circumstances were already shifting in ways that might soon make such a meeting unnecessary, or that the careful boundaries she had maintained throughout her renewed connection with Cale were about to be tested by developments neither she nor Cale could have fully anticipated when their story began reconnecting months earlier. Several days later, in the training grounds of Corwin's territory, a warrior named Lucian received the letter Seraphine had carefully composed, his hands trembling slightly as he recognized her familiar handwriting on the sealed parchment. He had not expected to hear from her directly, not since her marriage began, and the careful distance they had both maintained out of respect for circumstances neither could control. He retreated to a quiet corner of the barracks before breaking the seal, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and apprehension as he unfolded the letter and began reading. Seraphine's words were careful, measured in the way of someone accustomed to political caution, but beneath the careful phrasing, Lucian recognized something he had not allowed himself to hope for in over 2 years. She spoke of changing circumstances, of possibilities she could not yet fully explain, but wished him to know existed, of feelings that had never truly faded, despite the distance and duty that had separated them. She asked him to remain patient, to trust that whatever developments unfolded in the coming months, her feelings for him remained exactly as steady as they had been before her marriage began. Lucian read the letter 3 times before carefully folding it and tucking it into his uniform, close to his heart, a physical reminder of hope he had believed permanently lost. He had watched Seraphine from a respectful distance since her marriage, attending diplomatic functions where their paths occasionally crossed, always maintaining the careful formality their positions required, though the longing in her eyes during those brief encounters had never fully disappeared, mirroring the same ache he carried within his own heart. That evening, as he stood watch along the training grounds under a canopy of stars, Lucian allowed himself, for the first time in years, to imagine a future where duty and rank no longer stood between himself and the woman he had loved since childhood, before either of them understood the complications that station and family expectation would eventually place upon their connection. He did not know the details of what Seraphine's letter hinted at, could not guess at the delicate political negotiations unfolding within the castle walls regarding a potential annulment, but the simple fact that she had reached out, had broken the careful silence they had maintained throughout her marriage, filled him with a cautious hope that colored his thoughts throughout the following days, a quiet flame he protected carefully against the possibility of disappointment, while allowing himself to believe, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, that their story might not yet be finished. Back within the castle, Cale and Seraphine continued their careful planning over the following week, drafting potential approaches to the delicate matter of ending their marriage without destabilizing the alliance it had been designed to secure. They agreed to proceed slowly, allowing the healing exchange initiative time to demonstrate its value, before raising the more sensitive question of annulment with Corwin and the broader council of advisors, who would need to approve such a significant political shift. Cale found himself torn between excitement at the possibility of a future finally open to pursuing Elira without the constraints of his current marriage, and genuine concern about navigating the political complications such a change would inevitably create. He understood, better than most, how quickly carefully built peace could unravel when political leaders felt their honor or authority challenged, and he was determined not to let personal happiness come at the cost of renewed conflict between their territories. As autumn deepened into the early signs of winter, the castle settled into a period of careful preparation, both political and personal, while in Thornfield, Elira continued her own preparations for the healing exchange, unaware of how close the resolution to her complicated situation with Cale had actually become, or how many careful pieces were already moving into place to finally allow their long-delayed future together to become possible. Doran, ever watchful of the political currents surrounding his king, noticed the subtle shift in both Cale and Seraphine's demeanor over the following days, the quiet conversations that continued behind closed doors, the careful looks exchanged during council meetings that suggested some private understanding neither had yet shared with him directly. He said nothing, trusting that Cale would confide in him when the time proved right, though his years of service had taught him to recognize when significant change approached, even before it was formally announced. Word of the growing cooperation between the two territories, meanwhile, had begun reaching Corwin's court through his own network of advisors and traveling merchants. The Crimson Pack leader received these reports with careful interest, pleased by the progress of the healing exchange but privately curious about the increasingly frequent mentions of the Alpha King's visits to the border healer, wondering, in his own calculating way, whether such personal complications might eventually present opportunities, or perhaps risks, that his own diplomatic strategy would need to account for in the months ahead. The third time Cale arrived at Thornfield claiming injury, Elira knew immediately, before he even dismounted his horse, that no genuine wound awaited her examination. She watched from her doorway as he approached, walking with a limp so carefully exaggerated that she nearly laughed despite the seriousness of everything unresolved between them. "Let me guess," she said as he reached her hut, arms crossed and eyebrow raised in the familiar expression he had come to recognize as her particular blend of amusement and exasperation. "Another hunting accident, or perhaps this time a training mishap?" Cale had the decency to look slightly sheepish, though his eyes carried the same warmth that had grown increasingly difficult for her to resist over the past months. "A minor stumble during morning exercises, nothing serious, though I thought it prudent to have it examined." "Cale," Elira said, her tone softening despite her attempt at continued exasperation, "you cannot keep inventing injuries every few weeks. Eventually, someone beyond village gossip will question the pattern, and given the sensitive nature of our situation, that scrutiny could create real complications." "I know," Cale admitted, stepping closer, the pretense of his limp entirely abandoned now that the joke had run its course. "I came today not for a fake injury, Elira, but because I have real news to share. News that changes everything between us, if you're willing to hear it." Something in his tone, serious and hopeful in equal measure, made Elira's heart quicken, with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. She gestured him inside, closing the door behind them, to ensure privacy for whatever conversation was about to unfold. "What news?" she asked, settling onto the stool across from where he stood, too nervous herself to remain standing. "Seraphine and I have discussed the possibility of an annulment," Cale said, watching her reaction carefully. "Not immediately, not without careful political preparation, but the conversation has begun, and both of us believe it represents the right path forward, for reasons that extend beyond simply my feelings for you." Elira's breath caught, hope and caution warring within her chest, as she processed the significance of what he was telling her. "An annulment, Cale. That's an enormous decision, one that could seriously destabilize the peace between your territories." "We're aware of the risks," Cale said, kneeling before her stool so their eyes remained level, the gesture carrying an intimacy that made her pulse quicken further. "But Seraphine has her own reasons for wanting this, reasons entirely separate from my feelings for you. She loves someone else, Elira, a warrior named Lucian who has served her father's guard for years. Our marriage has kept them apart just as duty once kept us apart." The revelation stunned Elira, reshaping her entire understanding of the marriage that had stood between her and Cale for so long. "She loves someone else? Then your marriage has been a partnership built on duty alone," Cale confirmed. "We've both understood this from the beginning, though we've never before discussed the possibility of ending it formally. The healing exchange with Corwin's territory has demonstrated that our peoples can maintain cooperation and mutual benefit independent of our marriage. We believe that success provides an opportunity to eventually propose an annulment without threatening the underlying alliance. Illyra absorbed this information slowly, recognizing the magnitude of what Cale was describing. The careful political calculations required to navigate such a sensitive transition without reigniting the very conflicts their marriage had originally been designed to prevent. What happens next, if you proceed with this plan? Seraphine and I will continue building evidence that our territory's cooperation extends beyond our marriage, Cale explained. Once we feel confident the alliance can withstand the transition, we'll present the annulment to Corwin and our respective councils, framing it as mutual recognition that our partnership, while politically valuable, has served its purpose and no longer requires the formal bond of marriage to maintain the peace we've built together. And if Corwin refuses to accept such reasoning? Illyra asked, practical concerns tempering the hope building within her chest. Then we'll need to find another approach, Cale acknowledged honestly. This isn't a guaranteed path, Illyra, and I don't want to offer false promises about how quickly or smoothly this transition might unfold. But I wanted you to know the truth, that I'm actively working toward a future where we might finally be together, without the complications that have separated us these past years. Illyra reached out, taking his hand in both of hers, the physical contact sending warmth through her entire body, despite the careful boundaries they had maintained throughout their renewed connection. Cale, I need you to understand something important before we go further down this path. I won't be the reason you rush into a decision that could harm your people, or reignite the conflict this marriage was meant to prevent. Whatever happens between us, it must come from genuine readiness, not haste driven by feelings alone, however strong those feelings might be. I understand, Cale said, covering her hands with his own, the gesture carrying tender reassurance. This isn't a decision made in haste, Illyra. Seraphine and I have discussed this carefully, weighing the risks against the genuine unhappiness of continuing a marriage that serves neither of our hearts. We believe, with careful preparation, this path forward serves everyone's true interests, not just our personal desires. They remained close together for a long moment, the weight of everything shared settling into a fragile but genuine hope neither had allowed themselves to fully embrace since Cale's return to her life. Finally, Illyra spoke again, a new thought occurring to her. I think I should meet her, she said. Seraphine, if we're truly moving toward a future where our lives might become connected through this transition, I don't want to remain a stranger to the woman whose own happiness depends on the same careful path forward. Cale considered this, surprised but pleased by her suggestion. I think she would welcome that. In fact, she mentioned something similar during our last conversation, expressing curiosity about the woman who has held my heart so steadily, despite everything working against us. Then perhaps, when circumstances allow, we should arrange such a meeting, Illyra suggested, not to negotiate the details of your marriage's dissolution, but simply to understand each other, to build whatever foundation might be needed for the complicated future we're all navigating together. I'll speak with her about arranging a visit, Cale promised, perhaps during the next phase of the healing exchange negotiations, when official business already provides reasonable cause for you to travel toward the castle. As their conversation continued, deepening into more detailed discussion of the careful path forward both politically and personally, Illyra found herself experiencing a lightness she had not felt in years, a genuine hope that the future she had once believed permanently lost might finally become possible, however much careful navigation remained necessary before that future could fully materialize. Before Cale departed that afternoon, he paused once more at her doorway, the familiar gesture that had marked each of his visits since his return to her life. Thank you, Illyra, for your patience through all of this, for understanding the complications that have kept us apart, even as we've found our way back to each other, despite them. Thank you for finally being honest about everything, Illyra replied, her voice carrying genuine warmth despite the uncertainty still surrounding their future. Whatever happens next, Cale, I'm grateful we've found our way to this honesty, after so many years of silence and misunderstanding between us. As his procession departed down the eastern road once again, Illyra remained in her doorway longer than usual, watching until the last traces of dust settled along the horizon, her heart carrying a fragile hope she had not allowed herself to fully embrace in years. Whatever challenges remained ahead, whatever careful political navigation Cale and Seraphine would need to manage before any formal annulment could proceed, she found herself, for the first time since his initial return, genuinely believing that their long-delayed future together might finally be within reach. That evening, unable to contain the swirl of emotions the conversation had stirred within her, Elira sought out old Bram, finding him tending his small garden behind his cottage as the last light of day faded from the sky. He looked up as she approached, reading the mixture of hope and nervous energy written plainly across her features. "Something has changed," he observed, setting down his gardening tools and gesturing for her to join him on the small bench near his herb beds. "Kale and Seraphine are considering an annulment," Elira said, the words still feeling unreal, even as she spoke them aloud. "She loves someone else, old Bram. Their marriage has been a partnership of duty alone, just as I suspected, but never fully understood until today." Old Bram nodded slowly, absorbing this significant development with his characteristic calm. "And how do you feel about this news?" "Hopeful," Elira admitted, though frightened as well. "So much still needs to happen before anything can be certain. Corwin must be convinced. The political consequences must be carefully managed. And even if all of that succeeds, I still don't fully know what a future with Kale would actually look like, given everything that's changed for both of us over these 6 years apart." "Those are reasonable fears," old Bram said gently. "But I notice you no longer speak of anger or old betrayal, Elira. Only the practical complications of a future you're finally allowing yourself to hope for. That represents significant healing, regardless of how the political details eventually resolve themselves." Elira considered his words, recognizing their truth, even as uncertainty continued to churn within her chest. "I suggested meeting Seraphine directly, before matters progress further. I think I need to understand her, not as an obstacle or a stranger, but as someone navigating this same complicated situation from her own perspective." "That seems wise," old Bram agreed. "Sometimes the people we imagine as rivals or obstacles become, upon closer understanding, simply fellow travelers navigating similarly difficult circumstances. I suspect you and the Queen may find more common ground than you currently expect." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars begin appearing across the darkening sky, before Elira finally rose to return to her hut, her mind still processing everything the day had revealed. As she walked home through the quiet village, she found herself imagining, for the first time in years, what a genuine future with Kale might actually look like, beyond the careful boundaries and stolen conversations that had defined their renewed connection thus far. Meanwhile, far from Thornfield, within the walls of Corwin's own territory, a quiet observer had been tracking the growing reports of the Alpha King's frequent visits to the border healer, with considerably more suspicion than casual village gossip typically warranted. A trusted advisor to Corwin, a sharp-eyed woman named Petra who had served as the leader's chief informant for over a decade, brought her concerns directly to her leader's private study. "The pattern has become too consistent to dismiss as coincidence," Petra reported, laying out a series of notes documenting the Alpha King's visits over recent months. 3 separate injuries, each requiring treatment from the same healer, each visit extending longer than medical necessity would typically demand. Combined with the King's evident satisfaction following these visits, I believe there is a personal relationship developing that extends beyond simple medical care." Corwin studied the documented pattern with the same calculating attention he applied to all political matters, his expression giving little indication of his true thoughts on the matter. Interesting, though not entirely surprising. Political marriages rarely satisfy the heart's deeper needs. "What concerns me is not the King's personal affairs, but whether this relationship might eventually threaten the alliance our territories have worked to build. There's more," Petra continued, producing an additional report. "Similar rumors suggest the Queen herself maintains a private connection to a warrior within your own guard, a man named Lucian. If both the King and Queen harbor feelings for others outside their marriage, one must wonder how long the arrangement itself can realistically continue." Corwin's expression sharpened at this additional revelation, understanding immediately the political implications such information carried. "If their marriage dissolves, our alliance loses its most direct binding mechanism. That represents a significant risk to the peace we've worked to establish, regardless of whatever cooperative initiatives, like the healing exchange, might suggest about continued goodwill between our territories." "How would you like me to proceed?" Petra asked. "Continue monitoring the situation closely," Corwin instructed. "I want to know immediately if either the king or queen takes concrete steps toward formalizing any change to their marital arrangement. Such a significant shift would require careful negotiation to ensure our territory's interests remain protected, regardless of the personal reasons behind any potential annulment. As Petra departed to continue her careful surveillance, Corwin remained alone in his study, considering the delicate balance of power his territory's alliance with Kael's people currently maintained. He had no particular objection to the personal happiness of either the king or queen, but he understood, better than most, how quickly political stability could unravel when the formal bonds meant to secure peace began shifting beneath the weight of individual desire, however genuine and understandable those desires might prove to be. The formal envoy from Corwin's territory arrived at the castle earlier than expected, catching Kael and Seraphine still finalizing the careful preparations they had planned for eventually presenting the annulment proposal. Petra herself led the small delegation, her expression carrying none of the warmth typically extended during diplomatic visits between allied territories. My Lord Corwin requests immediate clarification regarding certain matters affecting the stability of our alliance, Petra announced formally, once ushered into the castle's main receiving hall, where Kael and Seraphine waited alongside Doran and several other advisors. What matters concern him? Kael asked, though the careful formality in Petra's tone already suggested he understood the general direction this conversation would take. Reports have reached my lord, regarding the personal circumstances of both yourself and Queen Seraphine, Petra said directly. Specifically, rumors suggesting attachments outside your marriage that may indicate intentions to dissolve the formal bond, securing peace between our territories. The directness of the accusation, arriving before Kael and Seraphine had completed their careful preparation for such a conversation, created immediate tension within the receiving hall. Doran stepped forward slightly, ready to offer diplomatic deflection, but Kael raised a hand, signaling his intention to address the matter directly, rather than through careful evasion. The rumors are not entirely inaccurate, Kael said, his voice steady, despite the gravity of admitting such sensitive information, before it had been properly prepared for formal discussion. Queen Seraphine and I have discussed the possibility of an annulment, though no formal decision has yet been reached, and any such transition would be handled with the utmost care for maintaining the alliance between our peoples. Petra's expression remained carefully neutral, though the weight of Kael's admission clearly registered as confirmation of what Corwin had suspected. My lord will not view such news favorably, Alpha King. This marriage represents the foundation of trust between our territories following years of conflict. Its dissolution, regardless of personal reasons, risks undermining everything we've worked to establish. We understand the concern, Seraphine interjected, her own composure carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to navigating delicate political situations. Which is precisely why we've spent recent months building additional foundations for cooperation between our territories. Initiatives like the Healing Exchange that demonstrate our people's commitment to peace extends beyond the formal bond of our marriage alone. Initiatives that remain unproven, particularly against the weight of tradition your marriage represents, Petra countered. My lord requests that both of you travel to his territory within the fortnight to discuss this matter directly, before any further steps toward annulment are considered. He wishes to understand fully how such a transition would be managed, and what guarantees might be offered to ensure the alliance's continued stability. The demand, while not entirely unreasonable given the significance of the matter, created immediate complications for the careful timeline Kael and Seraphine had planned. Rather than allowing the Healing Exchange additional time to prove its value, they would now need to defend their intentions directly to Corwin far sooner than anticipated, with considerably less preparation than they had hoped to establish. We will honor his request, Kael said finally, understanding that refusing such a summons would only deepen Corwin's suspicion and potentially damage the alliance further. Please inform your lord that we will arrive within the requested time frame, prepared to discuss this matter with the seriousness and respect it deserves. After Petra and her delegation departed, the receiving hall fell into tense discussion among Kael, Seraphine, and their closest advisors, all recognizing the significant challenge now facing their careful plans. Doran, ever practical, immediately began outlining the political arguments they would need to present to satisfy Corwin's concerns. We need concrete demonstrations of continued cooperation, beyond mere promises, Doran advised. Perhaps formal agreements regarding trade, mutual defense commitments independent of the marriage, something that provides Corwin tangible assurance that our territory's relationship extends beyond the personal bond currently uniting our leadership. The healing exchange alone may not satisfy him, Seraphine added. We should consider what additional commitments we're willing to formalize, agreements that would remain binding, regardless of whether our marriage continues or dissolves. As the group worked through potential strategies for the upcoming meeting with Corwin, word of the summons inevitably reached beyond the castle walls, carried through the same networks of gossip and speculation that had first brought news of Cale's frequent visits to Thornfield. Within days, Alira herself received word of the developing crisis, delivered by a traveling merchant who had heard the news during his most recent journey through the territory. The information filled Alira with immediate concern, understanding the significant risk now facing the fragile hope she and Cale had begun to share. If Corwin rejected the possibility of annulment outright, if his suspicion escalated tensions between the territories once again, everything they had worked toward, both politically and personally, might collapse entirely, potentially reigniting the very conflict the original marriage had been designed to prevent. She found herself unable to focus properly on her village duties over the following days, her mind constantly returning to the uncertain outcome awaiting Cale and Seraphine's meeting with Corwin. When Ivy noticed her distraction, Alira finally shared the full situation, needing someone to confide in, as the weight of uncertainty grew increasingly difficult to bear alone. What if he refuses to accept the annulment? Ivy asked, her young face creased with worry on her teacher's behalf. What happens then? I don't know, Alira admitted honestly. Perhaps Cale and Seraphine remain married indefinitely, trapped in a partnership neither truly wants, simply to maintain peace between the territories. Or perhaps the situation escalates into something far more dangerous, if Corwin views the potential annulment as sufficient insult to justify renewed conflict. The uncertainty weighed heavily on both of them as they continued their daily work, the healing exchange preparations continuing, alongside the anxious wait for news from the critical meeting that would determine so much about the future both territories, and Alira's own hopes for a life with Cale, would eventually take. Nearly 2 weeks passed before word finally reached Thornfield regarding the outcome of the delegation's journey to Corwin's territory. A rider arrived at dusk, requesting to speak with Alira directly, carrying a message sealed with the Alpha King's personal insignia rather than official castle correspondence, suggesting news of a deeply personal nature rather than simple political update. Alira's hands trembled as she broke the seal, unfolding the letter with anxious anticipation, uncertain whether the news it carried would bring hope or devastating disappointment after weeks of uncertain waiting. Cale's familiar handwriting filled the page, describing in careful detail the difficult negotiations that had unfolded within Corwin's court. The Crimson Pack leader had initially reacted with the anger and suspicion Doran had feared, viewing the potential annulment as a direct challenge to the honor and stability of the alliance his own daughter's marriage represented. But Seraphine, drawing on skills honed through years of careful political navigation, had presented a compelling case, emphasizing the healing exchange's early success and proposing additional formal agreements that would bind the territories together, independent of the marriage itself. The negotiations had extended across several tense days, with Corwin ultimately agreeing to consider the annulment favorably, provided both territories formalized additional trade and mutual defense agreements that would replace the marriage as the primary foundation securing their alliance. He had also insisted, as a condition of his acceptance, that the transition be handled with appropriate ceremony and respect, ensuring no perception of dishonor attached to either party involved. Most significantly, Cale's letter revealed, Corwin had learned of Seraphine's feelings for Lucian during the negotiations, information that had initially caused considerable tension given the warrior's relatively modest rank within the Crimson Pack Guard. But Seraphine had spoken passionately about the genuine nature of their connection, and Corwin, perhaps recognizing echoes of his own past choices, or simply persuaded by his daughter's evident sincerity, had ultimately agreed to consider Lucian's elevation in rank, should the relationship eventually progress toward formal courtship following the annulment's completion. Alira read the letter twice, tears of relief and cautious joy filling her eyes, as the significance of the news settled fully into her understanding. The path forward remained complicated, still requiring careful formal proceedings and additional political agreements before the annulment could be finalized. But the immediate crisis had been navigated successfully, without the devastating conflict she had feared might result from Corwin's initial suspicion. The letter closed with words that made her heart swell with renewed hope for their shared future. Cale wrote that he would return to Thornfield once the formal proceedings allowed, that he wished to introduce her properly to Seraphine as promised, and that he could finally, for the first time since his return to her life, begin imagining a future together built on honesty and freedom rather than stolen moments and careful pretense. As she folded the letter carefully and pressed it against her chest, Elira allowed herself, finally, to fully embrace the hope that had been building cautiously within her heart since Cale's initial return to Thornfield months earlier. Whatever challenges remained in the careful political proceedings still required to complete the annulment, the greatest obstacle standing between them had finally been successfully navigated, opening a path toward the future they had both once believed permanently lost to circumstances beyond their control. Within Corwin's territory, following the conclusion of the tense negotiations, Seraphine found a rare private moment to seek out Lucian, her heart pounding with nervous anticipation as she approached the training grounds where he stood watch. He noticed her approach immediately, straightening with the formal respect his position required, though his eyes carried the same quiet longing she had grown accustomed to seeing whenever their paths crossed over the past 2 years. "My father knows," she said quietly, once close enough that their conversation would not carry to other guards stationed nearby. "About my feelings for you, I told him during the negotiations regarding the annulment." Lucian's composure faltered slightly at this revelation, uncertain what such knowledge might mean for his own position within the guard, or for whatever future might now exist between them. How did he respond? "With more understanding than I expected," Seraphine admitted, a genuine smile breaking through her usual careful composure. "He agreed to consider your elevation in rank, should our connection eventually progress toward formal courtship once my marriage to Cale has been properly dissolved." The hope that flickered across Lucian's face mirrored exactly what Seraphine felt within her own chest, years of careful restraint finally beginning to loosen their hold on both their hearts. "Seraphine, are you certain this is truly what you want? The path ahead remains complicated, and I would never wish to see you sacrifice your position or your father's respect for my sake. I've spent 2 years watching us both quietly suffer, Lucian, maintaining distance out of duty and propriety, while our true feelings remained buried beneath careful formality," Seraphine said, her voice steady with newfound conviction. "I'm tired of sacrificing genuine happiness for the sake of appearances alone. Whatever complications remain ahead, I would rather face them honestly, working toward a future we both truly want, than continue this careful pretense indefinitely." Their conversation remained brief, constrained by the formal boundaries still governing their positions, until the annulment proceedings formally concluded. But the exchange carried a warmth and hope neither had allowed themselves to fully express in over 2 years of careful distance. As Seraphine finally departed to rejoin the delegation preparing for their return journey to the castle, she carried with her a lightness of spirit that had been entirely absent from her demeanor throughout the difficult years of her political marriage. Back at the castle, preparations began in earnest for the formal proceedings that would finalize both the annulment and the additional trade and defense agreements Corwin had requested as conditions for his acceptance. Doran worked tirelessly alongside advisors from both territories, drafting careful documentation that would satisfy all parties while ensuring the transition proceeded smoothly, without leaving room for future disputes or misunderstandings regarding the terms both sides had agreed upon. True to his promise, Cale arranged for Elira to finally meet Seraphine directly, a private meeting held within the castle gardens away from the formal attention of court and advisors, allowing the two women space to speak honestly, without the pressure of political ceremony coloring their conversation. Elira arrived nervously, uncertain how such an unusual meeting might unfold, though Seraphine's warm greeting quickly eased much of her apprehension. "I've heard a great deal about you," Seraphine said, gesturing for Elira to join her on a stone bench positioned beneath a canopy of autumn-colored leaves. "Cale speaks of you with a warmth I've never heard him express regarding anyone else, not even during our earliest days together, when we were still learning to build our unusual partnership." "I've heard much about you as well," Elira replied, her nervousness giving way to genuine curiosity about the woman whose own complicated circumstances had shaped so much of her and Kale's story these past months. I understand we share more in common than either of us might have initially expected. Seraphine smiled, the expression carrying genuine warmth, rather than the careful political composure Alira had anticipated. Both of us, loving people, we were once told we could never have, both finally finding paths toward happiness we had nearly given up hoping for. I think, given everything we've each navigated these past years, we might understand each other rather well. They spoke for nearly an hour that afternoon, Alira learning more about Seraphine's own history, her feelings for Lucian, the careful political skills she had employed throughout the recent negotiations with her father, while Seraphine, in turn, asked genuine questions about Alira's years as Thornfield's healer, the strength that had carried her through 6 years of uncertain waiting before Kale's eventual return. By the conversation's conclusion, something resembling genuine friendship had begun forming between the two women, an unexpected but welcome development, given the complicated circumstances that had originally connected their separate stories. As Alira finally departed the castle gardens to begin her journey back toward Thornfield, she carried with her not just renewed hope for her own future with Kale, but genuine goodwill toward Seraphine and Lucian, as they, too, worked toward finally claiming the happiness circumstances had denied them for far too long. Winter had fully settled over the territory by the time the formal annulment proceedings finally reached their conclusion. Months of careful negotiation and diplomatic preparation, culminating in a ceremony held within Corwin's own territory to ensure appropriate respect for the sensitive nature of the transition. Alira watched from a place of honor alongside Doran and other close advisors as Kale and Seraphine formally dissolved their marriage before assembled representatives from both territories, the ceremony conducted with a dignity that honored the genuine service their partnership had provided during 2 difficult years of political necessity. Corwin himself presided over the proceedings, his expression carrying none of the suspicion or reluctance that had marked his initial reaction to the possibility of annulment months earlier. The additional trade and defense agreements Doran had carefully negotiated had proven sufficient reassurance regarding the alliance's continued stability, and Corwin had, over the following weeks, come to view the entire situation with something approaching genuine approval, particularly once he witnessed firsthand the evident happiness both his daughter and the Alpha King now carried, freed from the weight of an unwanted partnership. Following the formal proceedings, a quieter, more personal celebration unfolded within Corwin's territory, one that brought together the various threads of the story that had woven together over the preceding months. Seraphine, radiant with a happiness Alira had not witnessed during their earlier meeting in the castle gardens, stood beside Lucian, whose recent elevation in rank had finally opened the possibility of formal courtship between them, sanctioned now by Corwin's blessing, rather than hindered by the constraints that had separated them for so many years. I never truly believed this day would arrive, Seraphine confided to Alira, as they watched Lucian speaking animatedly, with several other guards, his happiness evident in every gesture and expression. Years of careful restraint, of believing duty, required permanent sacrifice of genuine happiness. I'm grateful, more than words can properly express, for the courage it took all of us to finally pursue something different. We built it together, Alira replied, genuine warmth coloring her words as she considered the unlikely friendship that had formed between them over recent months. Your honesty with Kale, his honesty with both of us, the careful political work everyone contributed to ensure this transition, served everyone's true interests, rather than just personal desire alone. It required courage from all of us. Across the gathering, Kale watched the exchange between the two women who had come to matter so significantly in his life story, his heart full with a happiness he had nearly forgotten was possible after years of duty-bound existence. Doran approached him quietly, offering a rare smile that reflected genuine satisfaction with how the difficult political navigation had ultimately resolved. The alliance remains secure, Doran observed. Perhaps even stronger than before, given the additional formal agreements now binding our territories together, independent of personal circumstances alone. Thank you for your careful guidance throughout this process, Kale said, genuine gratitude evident in his voice. I could not have navigated these complications without your wisdom and patience. It has been my honor to serve, both your father before you, and now yourself, Doran replied. Though I confess, Watching you finally claim happiness after years of dutiful sacrifice brings me particular satisfaction, beyond simple political success alone. As the celebration continued into evening, Kale finally found a quiet moment to seek out Illyra, drawing her away from the gathering toward a secluded garden path where they could speak privately amid the festivities marking the completion of their long, complicated journey back to each other. 6 years ago, I made you a promise beneath a summer sky, before circumstances I could not control tore us apart for far longer than either of us ever imagined possible, Kale said, taking both her hands in his own as they stood together beneath the winter stars, now beginning to emerge overhead. I have carried the weight of that broken promise every day since, wondering if I would ever have the opportunity to properly fulfill it. Illyra felt tears gathering in her eyes, though they carried none of the old grief that had once accompanied thoughts of that broken promise, only the fullness of hope finally realized, after years of uncertain waiting. You're fulfilling it now, Kale. Every difficult step of this journey, every careful negotiation and honest conversation, has led us back to exactly where we always belonged. Kale reached into his cloak, withdrawing a small object that caught the starlight as he opened his palm to reveal it, a delicate ring, crafted with the same careful attention to detail that had marked the small wooden bird he had given her so many years earlier. I am no longer bound by circumstances beyond my control, Illyra. No marriage, no political necessity stands between us any longer. I am asking you now, freely and completely, whether you will finally allow me to make good on the promise I made so long ago, to build a life together, as true partners, in love, rather than duty alone. Illyra's answer came without hesitation. 6 years of careful waiting, and months of complicated navigation, finally culminating in this single, perfect moment beneath the winter stars. Yes, Kale, I have loved you since before either of us understood how complicated love could become, and I will love you through whatever challenges our future together might still hold. As Kale slipped the ring onto her finger, sealing a promise finally free to be properly fulfilled after years of painful delay, the sounds of celebration continued drifting from the gathering nearby, unaware for the moment of the significant commitment being made within the quiet garden. When they finally returned to join the festivities, their joined hands and evident happiness required no formal announcement, the assembled guests recognizing immediately the significance of what had transpired, offering warm congratulations that carried none of the political calculation that had once shadowed every aspect of Kale's personal life. In the months that followed, preparations began for a wedding that would properly unite Kale and Illyra before their people, a celebration built not on political necessity, but on genuine love that had survived years of separation and complicated circumstance. The healing exchange between the two territories continued flourishing, providing tangible proof that the peace between their peoples rested on foundations far sturdier than any single marriage alone, exactly as Kale and Seraphine had hoped when they first began their careful path toward annulment. Seraphine and Lucian, freed from the constraints that had separated them for years, began their own careful courtship, supported now by Corwin's blessing, and the respect earned through years of patient service within his guard. Their story, like Kale and Illyra's, demonstrated that genuine happiness, pursued with honesty and courage, could ultimately triumph over circumstances that once seemed permanently insurmountable. Illyra's wedding to Kale took place the following spring, held in Thornfield itself rather than the grand castle that would eventually become her home, a choice that honored the village where their love had first been rekindled after years of painful separation. The entire community gathered to witness the ceremony, Ivy standing proudly beside her mentor as chief attendant, Old Bram offering blessing with words that spoke to the resilience and patience that had ultimately allowed true love to prevail, despite every obstacle placed in its path. As Kale and Illyra exchanged vows beneath the same summer sky where he had first promised, 6 years earlier, to return and build a future together, the ceremony carried the weight of every difficult year that had separated them, every careful conversation and honest confession that had ultimately guided them back to this moment. Corwin himself attended as an honored guest, his presence symbolizing the genuine peace now firmly established between their territories, built on foundations of mutual respect and cooperation, rather than the fragile political necessity that had once bound them together through marriage alone. Watching from among the gathered guests, Seraphine stood beside Lucian, their own courtship progressing steadily toward a future they too could finally claim, without the constraints that had once separated them. She caught Elira's eye during a quiet moment in the ceremony, offering a warm smile that spoke to the genuine friendship they had built, despite the unusual circumstances that had first connected their stories. Two women, who had each found their way to happiness through courage, honesty, and the willingness to pursue love, despite every obstacle, duty, and circumstance had placed in their path. As the celebration continued long into the evening, Thornfield alive with music and joy, in a way the small village had rarely witnessed, Elira found herself standing beside Cale, watching their community celebrate the culmination of a love story that had survived 6 years of separation, false injuries born from desperate longing, complicated political negotiations, and the courage required from everyone involved to finally choose genuine happiness over careful duty alone. "We made it," Cale said softly, echoing the disbelief and gratitude both of them carried after everything that had led to this perfect moment. "We did," Elira agreed, leaning into him as they watched the stars begin emerging over Thornfield, the same stars that had witnessed his original promise so many years earlier, now finally shining down upon its complete and joyful fulfillment. 6 years of waiting, 3 faked injuries, and 1 very complicated political situation later, but we finally made it home to each other. Cale laughed, the sound carrying genuine joy that had been largely absent from his life throughout the years of dutiful sacrifice preceding this moment. "I would do it all again, every difficult year, and every desperate excuse to see you, if it meant arriving exactly here, with you, finally free, to build the future we always deserved." Earlier that same morning, before the ceremony had begun, Elira had sat quietly in her old hut, now preparing to leave the small home that had witnessed both her deepest grief and her most fragile hope over the preceding years. Ivy helped her dress, carefully arranging flowers gathered fresh from the fields surrounding Thornfield into a simple crown that suited the healer, far better than any elaborate castle finery might have. "Are you nervous?" Ivy asked, tucking the final flower into place with careful fingers. "Terrified," Elira admitted, laughing softly at the honesty of her own answer. "Not of marrying Cale, never that, but of stepping into a life so different from everything I've known here, of becoming queen when I've spent my whole life simply being Thornfield's healer." "You'll still be a healer," Ivy pointed out. "Just one who happens to also wear a crown occasionally. And you'll have me continuing the healing exchange work here, so Thornfield won't lose everything you've built, even as you build something new alongside Cale." Elira turned to embrace her young apprentice, gratitude filling her chest at the thought of leaving her life's work in such capable hands. "You've grown into a remarkable healer yourself, Ivy. I could not be prouder of everything you've accomplished under my guidance these past years." "I learned from the best," Ivy replied, her own eyes bright with emotion, as the significance of the day settled fully upon them both. Old Bram arrived shortly after, offering his own quiet blessing, before escorting Elira toward the village center, where the ceremony would soon begin. He walked slowly beside her, his weathered hand steady on her arm, memories of her childhood training, and her years of quiet grief following Cale's initial departure, clearly weighing on his thoughts as they approached the gathered crowd. "Your mother would be proud," he said softly, just before they reached the ceremonial arch decorated with autumn flowers that had somehow bloomed again for this special occasion, a small miracle the village had taken as a good omen for the marriage about to be sealed beneath them. "She always believed love, true love, finds its way home eventually, however long and difficult the journey might prove." "Thank you, Old Bram," Elira said, her voice thick with emotion, as she embraced the man who had guided her through so much of her life's most significant moments. "For everything you've taught me, for your patience and wisdom throughout these difficult years." As they finally approached the ceremonial arch where Cale waited, dressed simply, despite his royal status, out of respect for the humble village that had first brought them together, Elira felt every trace of her earlier nervousness dissolve into pure, uncomplicated joy. The gathered crowd fell silent as she approached, all eyes fixed on the culmination of a love story that had captured the hearts of everyone who had witnessed even fragments of its difficult journey toward this beautiful conclusion. The ceremony itself proceeded with simple but heartfelt vows, each of them speaking honestly about the years of separation, the pain of duty-bound circumstance, and the enduring love that had ultimately guided them back to each other despite every obstacle placed in their path. When Kale finally sealed their union with a gentle kiss before the assembled community, cheers erupted throughout Thornfield, a celebration 6 years in the making finally reaching its joyful, long-awaited conclusion. As their story concluded that spring evening in Thornfield, surrounded by friends, family, and the community that had witnessed both their original separation and their eventual reunion, Kale and Alira stood together as true partners at last. Their long and complicated journey finally arriving at the happy ending both had once feared would remain forever beyond their reach, proving that genuine love, however delayed or complicated by circumstance, could ultimately triumph when both people remained brave enough to fight for it until the very end.